gotta make some adjustments as per usual. Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binaries. Welcome to the Chamber of the Wraith. My name is Brian, and tonight, I gotta do a couple of things real quick. First, I'm going to send this out to peeps. I need to send this out to some peoples. There we go. And then I need to do this. I apologize that this isn't quite a thing yet. I'm just getting things started. And one last really quick thing. That ought to do it. Okay, so that's about as much sandification as I'm capable of at this very moment. I'm cold, so blanket. This is what I get for shaving my freaking head. In any case, today we are going to be reading a book that I quite enjoy. A little bit of a quick background. This is After Man, A Zoology of the Future. Keep in mind that this is actually the 2018 version. Also, I'm a little upset that this is actually mirrored. Is there a way for me to be able to fix that? Not right from here. Edit, customization. Yeah, no, nothing from here. Nope. That is rather unfortunate, but it is what it is. So, After Man, A Zoology of the Future. What the heck is this thing? Well, the author, Dougal Dixon, who is a paleontologist and a geologist from Scotland, wanted to write a book detailing the processes of evolution and how it can cause a world to change dramatically. See a few examples of animals on the back here. Now, and of course on the front title. Now, he made the original book in 1990, over 30 years ago. So, and this book had actually been out of proper print for a decade. That was until 2018, where this book, in the 37 years since its official publication, 37 years, was it 1980? I apologize. I thought it would have been. Hang on a tick. Let me see. After Man published date 1981. Oh, I thought it came out in 1990. I might be confusing it with a different book of Dixon's. So yeah, this book is over 40 years old. So in 2018, they republished this thing, but they this new edition. What it primarily does is that there are bits and pieces in here that were out of date in terms of understanding of evolution. So Some of the bits and pieces of evolution were out of date because, we just didn't have enough information, or attitudes have changed in the intervening 37 years in between things. Oh, good God, I forgot to mute a Discord server. That is going to get annoying in a real hurry. Hold on a minute there. There we go. There we go. There we go. Right. In any event, so this little book is the very first speculative evolution project. Now, for those who are not in the know and are not within this relatively niche genre or haven't seen much about this, speculative evolution is exactly what it sounds like. How do you take the processes of evolution and move them along in certain ways? Now, this is actually pretty common in science stuff. I mean, in terms of speculative evolution, some of the tropes and whatnot that are used and the ways that it is discussed is actually used in modern paleontology. Not to the degrees of creating things like the things in After Men, most of the time, but mostly in things like, okay, what kind of an environment would have produced an animal like T-Rex? Or, ooh, I can kind of do that now. That's cool. Or perhaps maybe what could they have evolved from, or are there any records missing in the that could have led to this? Like a perfect example is, what the hell were the ancestors of pterosaurs, the flying reptiles? Because there aren't any direct connecting links, so scientists have to get speculative and hazard a guess as to what in the Sam hell that is. So that's what they're so there's where a little bit of speculative evolution comes in. But in terms of science fiction, speculative evolution comes primarily in two key flavors. Either finding out how life evolves on an alien planet, or taking a look at life in the future, as After Man does. And After Man is one of the first major science fiction things to have come out that got any level of success talking about this sort of thing directly and specifically. In fact, this was so popular that this actually got a Japanese stop-motion animated documentary with Dougal Dixon himself as the host. The Japanese love Dougal Dixon to the degree that in 2010 he published a book called Green World, which was based off of his original draft for a story that he wanted to do called Man After Man, which Man After Man did come out in the mid-90s, but Man After Man, he did not like how it turned out, and it's honestly not that good. So I'm with Dougal on that one. But he's very popular in Japan, to the degree that this Green World book is only published in Japan. You can't get an English copy of the books, plural, I believe. Green World is only available in Japan, and After Man has taken off. There was even an anime series that was unfortunately lost to the sands of time, a children's anime series that takes place in the After Man world, alongside the stop-motion, more traditional documentarian fare, which I think would be kind of neat if anybody this side of the pond ever decided to take a crack at, which Dougal wanted. The rights to After Man were sold, I believe, to DreamWorks in the late 90s to do some sort of animated series based off of After Man, but it never resurfaced. It never surfaced anywhere. Japan got stuff done with the After Man license, but nobody did anything over here. In fact, it wasn't until 2003 that we got anything like what Dougal Dixon had in mind for After Man, and that was The Future is Wild, which doesn't even touch the time period that we have here. It's effectively a child of After Man, but it is not After Man, right? So today I wanted to give the progenitor of modern speculative evolution some credit and do a live reading of the whole thing. Now, it's an interesting proposition because I believe including some of these pages don't even have numbers. Let's see, like of all of the numbered pages here, there are, I believe, 118, but I believe it's closer to 125. Yeah, because index because of the index. So 120, 121, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 126 pages in this book, which doesn't seem too bad, but I'll show you a quick example of what I have to deal with. I have to deal with a lot of this, lots of text and diagrams and things, so it might take a while for me to get through this book, but I want to hammer through as much of this as I can before 6:30, because at that point I have to go. I genuinely have to leave at 6:30. So since we dilly-dallied a little bit too long already, and we have less than 4 hours, let's get started with After Man, A Zoology of the Future by Dougal Dixon, with the introduction by Desmond Morris. Oh, and for anything that has pictures or anything like that, I'll be like a first or second grade reader, find a thing, read the text, and then turn it around and show you guys. Some of the praises in the back. There's a bit from the introduction by Desmond Morris, which we will read. Uncannily believable. Dixon's invented animals, some of them beautiful enough to live. That's a very interesting choice of words there. Engender reflection about the mysterious forces that work beneath the skin of real animals. The New York Times Book Review. Again, New York Times. It's a very odd choice of words. Dixon's brief explanation on the principles of evolution, hopefully it's brief, is so lucid, and the detailed illustrations of futuristic beasts are so charming that After Man is bound to captivate readers of all ages by the Chicago Sun-Times. That's how you do a review. You don't coyly hint at certain things not being worth the right to live. And there's a few of the animals in the back there. You can see a weird toothy jerboa, what looks like a cross between a rabbit and a zebra, a goose that decided to hang out upside down, and a whole bunch of other things. All of these, in one form or another, will be covered in the book. So don't worry if you see anything and it's like, huh? So let's get started with After Man, A Zoology of the Future by Dougal Dixon, with the introduction by Desmond Morris. This is actually kind of what the original cover looked like. I have the first edition of this book. Actually, and it does kind of look more like this, but this animal here is bigger, filling out more of the space naturally. So just a little something to keep in mind. For Gavin, the author and publisher would like to express their thanks to the illustrators of this book. They are Diz Wallace, John Butler, Brian McIntyre, Philip Hood, Roy Woodard, and Gary Marsh. All illustrations are based on the author's original sketches and designs. So that's cool. Contents. Author's introduction to the new edition. Introduction by Desmond Morris. Author's introduction. Evolution. The history of life. Life after man. Various habitats like the temperate woodlands and grasslands. Coniferous forests. Tundra and the polar regions. Deserts, the arid lands, tropical grasslands, and tropical forests. Is there an option to have captions rolling? It's not going to be 100% accurate, but for those who are, do I not have that option? Crap. Well, I apologize. I'm hoping to make the Chamber of the Wraith more accessible in the future. I would love to do captions of my own, but captions are a lot of work for a lot of the videos I do, especially since I don't have a script that I can just in there. So it is what it is. And then the future, and then the appendix, which is actually useful. This is a facsimile. This is a facsimile. Is that not like insulting? That's a sorry. An exact copy. Okay, so it's not necessarily, so it just means it's an exact copy. Okay, this is a facsimile reproduction of the 1981 first edition of After Man by Dougal Dixon. Some text has been changed at the request of the author to reflect scientific discoveries made in the intervening years. These changes have been made in a slightly different typeface to make their presence clear. So I would have done something like an underline, make it obvious, but hey, you do you, I suppose. Author's introduction to the new edition. It is now 35 years since I wrote After Man. A long time, half a lifetime in human terms, but just a blink of an eye, just a blink of a compound eye compared with the 50 million years envisaged in the book. I should probably grab my water after I read this. To put it in context, if we look back 50 million years, we are looking at a time when the dinosaurs had not long gone, and the mammal dynasty was establishing itself with all sorts of new shapes and strategies to fill the gaps left by the departed rulers. And just look at what has happened in the last 50 million years. A whole group of mammals, the multituberculates, that had struggled through the age of the dinosaurs, they were still flourishing in all kinds of spectacular forms. They have since become completely extinct, the only mammal group to do so. The monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, were quite widespread, but they have now almost gone. Only the platypus and echidna left. Horses in those days were rabbit-like scampering through undergrowth animals, nothing like they are now. The rhinoceroses too were like the early horses, but then developed into the biggest land mammals that ever existed before declining to the handful of weird-looking species we see today. At that time, the rhinoceros-like heavyweight horn-headed browsers were animals that looked a bit like rhinos but were completely unrelated. They have all gone now. And of course, our own ancestors were scurrying little lemur-like things. That was the order of change that I imposed on the animal world during the next 50 million years. Some of the ideas have dated, but most have not. Something that has changed is our knowledge and representation of life in the past. Have a look at the illustrations of the earlier part of the book. Had we rendered them nowadays, 35 years on, we would have changed the stances of the dinosaurs and covered some of them in feathers. The pterosaurs, too, would be fuzzy. Even the way in which we show the course of evolution in diagrammatic, that is a word I've never read in my life, in a diagrammatic form has changed. Gone is the traditional branching tree-like diagram on page 28 that suggests the development from one form to another, to be replaced by the modern cladogram that is based on the observed similarities between organisms. I intentionally ignored climate change, even though climate change was on the agenda at that time. However, the climate change envisioned in the late 1970s was not global warming, but the coming ice age. I also played down the evolution of plant life. The reason that I avoided these perfectly relevant issues was that I wanted to put realistic and recognizable backgrounds to these bizarre creatures that I was inventing so that the reader would not feel too alienated. The only background changes that I acknowledged were those brought about by plate tectonics and continental drift. Looking at the last 50 million years again, we see that that is an oversimplification. Back in those times, much of the Earth was covered in tropical forest. The great open grasslands had yet to evolve, along with cooler, drier climates. And these changes drove the evolution of the running, grazing animals that are such a significant part of the zoology today. When the book was published, much of the media claimed it was all about the extinction of man. Do you really think that man will become extinct? What do you think? Why do you think that man will die out? Were the sort of questions that inevitably arose during interviews. The assumption was that my book was supposed to be some sort of doom-laden prediction of forthcoming disasters. It was not. It was a glorification and exaltation of life itself. The fact was, and I thought that it was made clear in the book, that the extinction of man was just a device to get the discussion going. The book was about the natural forces of evolution, and man, with his big feet and his big hands, has too much of an influence, twisting the course of nature away from anything that can be predicted. With the removal of the interference, I was able to let nature get back to work, just like it did after the dinosaurs were wiped out. In the subsequent years, we have learned more and more about the wonders of the life around us. Many's the time that I have come across some new ecological or evolutionary development and thought, if I had put that in after man, everybody would have laughed. Still, some of the elements that I postulated have actually come true. There are the walking bats of New Zealand, not quite as extreme and spectacular as the night stalker on page 108, but getting there. Fossils of even larger species of these bats are now being found in the same region. Then there are the snakes in Mexico that live in caves and snatch flying bats out of the air, just like the anchor whip on page 88. And there is the parasite that alters the shape of its host so that it can be easily seen and eaten by a predator. And so the parasite passes to the next host of the next stage of its life cycle. Just like, well, you will see for yourself as you delve into this book. The book and its themes were turned into a traveling exhibition with dioramas and full-size animatronic models in Japan. It did a short US tour in the mid 1980s before the exhibitor became financially extinct. So it did have some US promotion back then. Its next incarnation was a fabulous 2-hour television spectacular, also in Japan in the early 1980s. It's on YouTube. But there was never a translation made for the rest of the world. I want to talk about this briefly because this is true, but unfortunately, it's mostly in parts now. I believe there was a full-size version of it that was uploaded in 280p on YouTube that has either been deleted or YouTube took it down a couple of years ago. If you could find it, that would be great. But I believe for sure, I believe for like 90% certainty that it's just gone. So unfortunately, it is what it is. Then Hollywood optioned it in the early 1990s and held onto it for 20 years before giving up on it. See, this is another thing I want to talk about really quick. I deny any association with any cinema film on a similar theme, or even with an identical name, that has been released in that period. Except, I guess, The Future is Wild, I suppose. But unless this is a direct denial of wanting to be involved in The Future is Wild, in which case, yikes. I mean that in the sense of, oh, wow. And in any case, that's interesting that Hollywood just kind of gave up on it. But because there is a hunger for this stuff, it would just have to be approached in a fashion I'm not entirely sure Hollywood is ready for. During that time, I have been involved in other future evolution projects, notably the Future is Wild television series. Okay, he does not deny that. The Kraken Adventure in Future Oceans, the IMAX presentation for Panasonic. I have got to check out some of these. The exhibition in the Westfälisches Förder Museum in Münster. That's German, I think. Despite my German heritage, I cannot speak a lick of the language. And futuristic sculptures for our theme park in New Quay Zoo, to name but a few. Since the publication of Afterman, the theme of future and alternative evolution has become an established trope of science writing and science fiction. I salute those other authors and artists who have picked up the baton or passed on the gene, as done so much in the genre over the last few decades, and feel flattered to think that Afterman may have been the work that inspired him. They definitely are inspired by Afterman. So often I've seen places like the Curious Archive talk about how Afterman has influenced much of speculative evolution. So pat yourself on the back there, Dixon. You done did good. Dougal Dixon from Dorset, October 2015. So this is a few years old. The introduction by Desmond Morris. As soon as I saw this book, I wished I had written it myself. It is a marvelous idea, beautifully presented. I do apologize for any background noise. I believe my sister and some friends are here. Many years ago, as a young zoologist, I started inventing imaginary creatures, drawing and painting them as an enjoyable contrast to the demands of my scientific studies. Released from the restrictions of evolution as it really is, I was able to follow my own private evolutionary whims. I could make monsters and strange organisms, plant growths, and fabulous beasts of any color, shape, and size I liked, letting them change and develop according to my own rules, giving my imagination full rein. I called them my biomorphs, and they became as real to me as the animals and plants of the natural world. Dougal Dixon's mind has obviously been working in a similar way, although the creatures he has brought to life are very different from mine. Instead of inventing a parallel evolution, as though it were taking place on another world, he has given himself the intriguing task of contemplating a future evolution on our own planet, closely based on species that exist at present. By waving a time wand and eliminating today's dominant species, including man, he has been able to watch, through his mind's eye, the lesser animals gradually taking over as the major occupants of the Earth's surface. This is an example of those older, of that older language of evolution being talked about. Just because a rabbit is smaller than an elephant doesn't make it any lesser for its environment. I mean, good luck trying to make an elephant burrow underground, for instance. Setting this, setting his scenario in the distant future, about 50 million years from now, he has given the members of his new animal kingdom time to undergo dramatic changes in structure and behavior. But in doing this, he has never allowed himself to become too outlandish in his invention. He has created this fauna of the future so painstakingly that each kind of animal teaches us an important lesson about the known processes of past evolution, about adaptation and specialization, convergence and radiation. By introducing us to fictitious examples of these factual processes, his book is not only great fun to read, but also has real scientific value. The animals on these pages may be imaginary, but they illustrate vividly a whole range of important biological principles. It is this, the way in which he has perfectly balanced his vivid dreamings with a strict scientific discipline, that makes his book so successful, and his animals so convincing, and incidentally, so superior to the often ridiculous monsters invented by the cheaper brands of science fiction. Ouch! Jeez! The only danger in reading this delightful volume is that some of you may reach the point where you suddenly feel saddened by the thought that the animals meticulously depicted in it do not exist now. It would be so fascinating to be able to set off on an expedition and watch them all through a pair of binoculars, moving about on the surface of today's Earth. Personally, I feel this very strongly as I turn the pages, and there is probably no greater praise that I can offer to the author than that, Desmond Morris. His signature is very interesting. Author's introduction. Evolution is a process of improvement. Hence, looking at the animals and plants of today and their interactions, the delicate balance between the flora, the herbivores, and the meat eaters, the precise engineering of the load-bearing structures of the giraffe's backbone, the delicate sculpting of the monkey's foot, enabling it to grasp objects as well as to climb trees, the subtle coloration of the puff adder's skin, hiding it completely among the dead leaves of the forest floor, and trying to project all of it into the future is a near impossibility. For how can you improve upon perfection? Can you please update this on YouTube later? How do you mean? This will be a proper upload. Shrek fan page. So this will just be a normal stream. It won't be chopped up into bits and pieces, but it will be a live reading regardless. Kind of like how I used to record Anatomy of a Metahuman. I just read directly from it. But calling it perfection, that's also a bit of a stretch. Again, an attitude of the old days, like, oh, everything is perfect. No. Evolution does what it can, but it's like, I like to analogize it to a college freshman who's a stoner, but who really wants to do things as best as they can. Sometimes you take shortcuts, and that's fine. One trend that is foreseeable, however, is the ruinous effect that man is having on the precise balance of nature. I have taken this not unjustifiably to an extreme, with man having extinguished the species that are already on the decline and having wreaked terrible destruction on their natural habitats before dying out himself and allowing evolution to get back to work, repairing his damage and filling in the gaps left behind. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Because this book came out in the early 1980s, topics about the age of man. It was a lot of things like it's the age of man, his inventions, that kind of thing. It isn't necessarily humans and their inventions. It's an example of how the language has changed greatly in the last almost 50 years. Almost 50? No, in the last 40 years. So bear that in mind. The language is old. Just keep that in mind. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Repairing his damage and filling in the gaps left behind. The raw materials for this reparation are the kinds of animals that do well despite or because of man's presence, and which will outlive him. Those that man regards as pests and vermin. These are more likely to survive than the highly modified and interbred domestic animals that he develops and encourages to suit his own needs. The result is a zoology of the world set arbitrarily 50 million years in the future, which I have used to expound some of the basic principles of evolution and ecology. The result is speculation built on fact. What I offer is not a firm prediction, more an exploration of possibilities. The future world is described as if by a time traveler from today who has voyaged the world of that time and has studied its fauna. Such a traveler will have some knowledge of today's animal life, and so he could describe things with reference to the types of animals that will be familiar to the reader. His reports will be written in the present tense as if addressed to fellow time travelers who have voyaged to the same period and wish to explore the world for themselves. Sit back, fellow time travelers, and enjoy the spectacle and drama of the evolution of life on your planet. Dougal Dixon, Wareham, 1981. The sketches on this page are selected from the author's own working drawings and were used by the artist to prepare the plates and illustrations for Afterman. So you can see Dougal Dixon's style for certain creatures that will become very important later on. In fact, I recognize them just being two of the same animal. I'm not going to spoil what they are just yet, but you will see what they look like when the other illustrators take care of this. Also, before I press on, I just want to say that this actually inspired my version of what an Afterman television series should look like, in which it was effectively, oh, speaking of animals, hello, Boots. Come on up, cat. Ow! Speaking of animals, my idea was that a time traveler would be going to the future and exploring life on Earth through Dougal Dixon's teachings, and then would kind of report back to present day experts and talk about how the processes of evolution work, kind of like a blend between Alien Planet and Afterman, if that makes any sense. Where we have Alien Planet science sections and the themes of reporting back to Earth, and Afterman's context of a time traveler coming to the future to investigate those animals. I think that'd be really cool to see personally, although I wouldn't necessarily go with a he, him personally. Evolution. The biological cell, shown here in the process of replicating itself, is the fundamental building block that makes up all living things. The cell's capacity for infinite variation when taking part in sexual reproduction is at the root of evolutionary development. An example of the diagram that I'm talking about. The form and position of living things on Earth can be attributed to two things: evolution and environment. The study of evolution explores how life originated, how it diversified the way it did, and how different creatures have developed from others. The study of a creature's environment, ecology, shows how the various life forms interact with each other and how they interact with the environment they inhabit. In other words, evolution can be thought of as showing a longitudinal section through the life of our planet, while ecology shows the same situation in cross-section. Each is inextricably entwined with the other, and the two cannot be studied totally independently. Although both aspects deal with survival, it should not be forgotten that extinction is a very important factor. Oh, jeez, I'm writing up. Without it, there would be no room for evolution to take place. There would be no new ecological situations for nature to fill by the evolution of new animals and plants from older stocks. That evolution has taken place is apparent both from the fossil record and from the evidence contained within living plants and animals. Examination of fossil remains reveal a general development from the simple to the more complex, and also the part played by the environment in shaping an organism to prevailing conditions. In living creatures, comparability in structure, embryonic development, and chemistry are powerful indications of similar evolutionary history or of common ancestry. Evolution is therefore not a process that has happened only in the past in order to establish the animals and plants of today's ecology, but is a constantly continuing process that we can study both from its results and from the fossil evidence of the past. It has happened, it is happening now, and it will continue to happen as long as life remains on this planet. Excuse me. I get very mucusy if I talk for too long, so I should really keep a box of tissues handy just to blow that out. Cell genetics. Animals and indeed plants are composed of microscopic bricks called cells. The cells found in different organs and tissues of the same creature are of quite different sizes and shapes, Bones are made of angular cells, kidneys from spherical cells, nerves from long, narrow cells. But all are made from similar components. Round the outside of each cell is the skin, the cell membrane, enclosing the gelatinous cytoplasm, which carries a number of small structures called organelles. The most important of these is the cell nucleus, which lies at the center of the cell and carries the information from which the entire organism is built. Most animal cells contain the same components. At the center lies the nucleus, labeled A, which contains the cell's genetic material. Bless me. Another one? Yep, I have another one. The mitochondrion, B, responsible for energy production, and the lysosome, C, which secretes chemical product, lie nearer the surface of the cytoplasm, D. The ribosomes, E, where the proteins are assembled, lie along a convoluted structure of membranes known as the endoplasmic reticulum, F. So as you can see from this diagram, I apologize if the focus is not great. You can see A is the nucleus, C is the cytoplasm, and so on from the diagram that is being talked about. This information is stored as a code made up from a sequence of components contained in a long molecule of a complex substance known as deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. The DNA molecule is a bit like a ladder that has been twisted through its length. The shafts of the ladder are made up of sugar phosphate molecules, and each rung consists of a pair of molecules known as nucleic acid bases. There are only 4 of these bases, and the sequence in which they are found along the twisted ladder give the coded instructions from which the whole organism is formed. Although repeated in its entirety in the nucleus of each cell of the organism, only certain parts of the code are needed to build up particular organs. The peculiar thing about the DNA molecule is its ability to reproduce itself. The molecule splits along its length and unwinds so that each half of the ladder consists of a shaft and a series of half rungs. The missing ladder halves are built from the pool of sugar phosphate bases, which is supplied by the creature's food and is present in each cell nucleus. As each of the 4 types of nucleic acid base in the strand attracts only a specific kind of nucleic acid base to itself, when 2 completely new strands of DNA are formed, they are absolutely identical to each other in the sequence of their components. This is the most important process involved in cell multiplication and underlies the growth of all organisms. However, to grow, organisms also require proteins in the form of either structural elements such as collagen, in this case of packing tissue between organs, or as enzymes, which aid specific biological processes. Although the production of proteins is carried on outside the cell nucleus, it is controlled by the DNA and is produced in a way analogous to DNA replication. Yeah. The messenger that transmits the DNA instructions to the protein production center, the ribosome, is a molecule known as RNA. It is formed along partly unzipped sections of DNA and differs only subtly from it. The messenger RNA travels to the ribosome, where it links up with another form of RNA, transfer RNA, which bears amino acids. We'll very quickly come back to this page to talk about the diagram before we move on. The sperm penetrates the ovum, A, and comes to lie alongside the ovum nucleus, B. the chromosomes of both sperm and ovum divide into separate strands known as chromatids. Corresponding chromatids move to opposite ends of the ovum, C, where they are surrounded by nuclear membranes, D. The structure then splits into separate cells, E. The basic principles of reproduction, at least in sexually reproductive organisms. Something like a hydra probably wouldn't need to worry about this too much. It is from these amino acids that the proteins are formed. The RNA molecules are merely code carriers and ensure that the amino acids link together in the correct sequence to form the protein type required. In this way, DNA controls the workings of the whole cell and hence of the whole organism. The DNA molecules in the cell nucleus are aggregated into structures called chromosomes, and specific groupings of nucleic acid-based sequences on the DNA give rise to specific traits in the organism. These groupings are called genes. Half the chromosomes in a creature's cells, and hence half its genes, come together from its mother and half from its father. This is reflected in the alignment of the chromosomes during cell division. Chromosomes then are arranged in pairs. Mother-donated ones align with identical father-donated ones so that comparable genes are side by side. Even though each gene in a pair contributes to the determination of a particular characteristic, one gene often masks the effect of another. As part of the reproduction process, special cells known as gametes, that is, sperm or eggs, containing only half the number of chromosomes found in ordinary cells, are formed in the sex organs. Although one chromosome from each pair is present in each gamete, none is identical to any of the chromosomes received from either the mother or the father, but contains a mixture of material from both parents. This characteristic of gamete chromosomes is primarily responsible for the variation between individuals of the same species that is seen in nature. During fertilization, the gametes unite with others from a second individual to produce a complete cell with the full number of chromosomes, which in turn divides and builds up a completely new organism with genetic characteristics derived from both parents. This is like middle high school science for most of you people. This, briefly, is the sophisticated mechanism that enables plants and animals to reproduce and pass on their distinctive traits from one generation to the next. It is small changes or mutations in the genes involved in this process that allow evolution to take place. A mutation results in a variation of the characteristic of the adult organism growing from the cell containing the gene. In most cases, the change that takes place is harmful and gives the organism a disadvantage in the competitive world outside. The organism perishes, and the mutant gene perishes with it. Occasionally, however, the mutant gene provides a trait that gives the organism a distinct advantage in its fight for survival. The variation in genetic makeup that sexual reproduction makes possible produces the range of characteristics that are found throughout individuals of a separate species, of a single species. Natural selection, which may be thought of as the directional impetus of evolution, acts on this variability, favoring certain characteristics and rejecting others according to their survival merit. This requires the context of environment and what an animal wants, because as much as we can influence the evolution of an animal to produce something like a house cat, natural selection can influence things as well, but so can the animal. Think about things like fiddler crabs, for instance, which I believe do get talked about later on in the book as an example. It's just worth bearing in mind that evolution is never linear. It's a great big mess. During cell division, when new cells are being formed, the DNA, A, contained within the dividing cell unzips and forms new molecules of DNA along its free ends, B, from the nucleic acid bases and sugar phosphates contained in the cell nucleus. To produce messenger RNA, the DNA comes apart partially, C, and links with broadly similar material. The sugar phosphate backbone is slightly different chemically, and one of the nucleic acids is substituted. The messenger RNA moves to the ribosomes, where it links up with the transfer RNA, which carries amino acids, D. The messenger RNA contains the code that ensures that the transfer RNA is linked together in the correct sequence to produce the chain of amino acids that form the desired protein. A little bit of an example of the process here, and try and move it up. I apologize that my camera's focus doesn't seem to be that great at the moment. Perhaps I can fix it if I improve the lighting. Sorry, cat. Okay, so now that we actually have a little bit of light, maybe you can see a little bit better, hopefully. That's kind of the hope anyway. Because unfortunately, the lights here are not great. I just want to clear some of those. Just want to clear some notifications, and then we'll move on. Ooh, new dinosaur. I have to check that out later. Maybe it's actually a dinosaur if it's just a bird. Just a bird, you know what I mean. Oh yeah, this is where we get to some of the fun stuff, both good and bad. Actually, I will be right back. I need to grab some water. And maybe change my shirt, because this one's riding up too much. It would appear one of the creatures that made a mess down here, so I gotta fix that too. The perks of live streaming and reading. If only I had some elevator music. Yes. Although I would advise not to. She said yeah. So it's not my sister, it's actually one of my younger cousins. There we go. I apologize again for the delay. It is very important. There we are. Here we are. Also, just can't beat literally ice cold water. That's a lot better already. All right, natural selection. Natural selection, resulting from the environmental conditions in which an organism lives, can have one of three different influences on a population. It can be stabilizing, directional, or diversifying. The stabilizing influence can be seen where conditions have remained unchanged over a long period of time. The resultant environment consequently supports a well-balanced population of animals and plants, which in evolutionary development is disadvantageous. One thing to keep in mind is that evolution is always going to be happening regardless of environment. It's just that it slows down a lot to mostly internal things like disease resistance and stuff like that. You don't see cats evolving into tigers. You see cats developing disease resistance, that sort of thing. The resultant environment consequently under such circumstances, any change occurring in a plant or animal will bring it out of the environment's neat, efficient, time-honored survival pattern and put the creature at a disadvantage, eventually resulting in its extinction. Its more conservative contemporaries, on the other hand, will survive. Animals that have been subjected to stabilizing selection for a long period of time may seem quite unspecialized and primitive compared to those of similar ancestry that have experienced a more eventful evolutionary history. Often they are characterized by passive survival mechanisms such as heavy armor or high fecundity to offset losses through predation. Fecundity, for those not in the know, means they reproduce a lot. The directional influence of natural selection is more evident when the environment itself changes. Under these circumstances, evolutionary changes occur such as to give the impression that the organism is evolving along a set path with a particular goal in view. That is quite erroneous and arises from the fact that, in the context of its environment, the most recent member of an evolutionary series always appears much better adapted than the earlier intermediate stages, which, where they are known, look half-formed and incomplete by comparison, even though they were equally well adapted to the environment's own earlier intermediate stages. An example of this is the evolution of the horse, which developed from a small forest-living browser into a large, long-legged running grazer, as its environment altered from forest to open grassy plain. The small changes that enabled it to deal most effectively with its changing environment were continually selected for throughout its history, and in this way, the horse evolved. The development of the horse is a perfect example of how a zoological family adapts to changing conditions. The earliest form of horse that we know is Hyracotherium, which I don't think is actually true anymore. I think it's more Propaleotherium now, but again, 40-year-old science here. A small rabbit-sized animal that browsed soft leaves and scampered through the undergrowth of the tropical forests that were widespread 60 million years ago. As the tropical climates changed and grasslands spread everywhere at the expense of the forests, only some descendants of Hyracotherium could flourish. These descendants were those that had changed and had developed the ability to run swiftly over open plains and to process the tough new food as represented by the growing grass. A number of different forms evolved, the most spectacular being the magnificent running animal that we have today. So you can see here, even in this relatively neat and tidy example, there are exceptions. We have Hyracotherium, Mesohippus? Plio. No, Mesohippus is up here, so it goes this way. Okay. Mesohippus, Merychippus, Pliohippus, and the Equus from about 2 million years. So you can see how Mesohippus worked really well for its environment because Mesohippus lived in an environment that suited it. But because the environment was changing along a particular path by sheer happenstance, the animal itself appears to be heading in that general direction. Stop chewing on things. Anyway, the diversifying influence of natural selection takes effect when a new environment is established, offering a fresh range of food resources and living spaces. An animal species entering this environment may well evolve different forms that are specifically adapted to each of the living spaces or ecological niches. Gotta love that. Gotta love small kids. In the absence of competing animals, these different forms will eventually develop into completely new species. That is the kind of thing that happens when an island, or a group of islands, is thrown up by volcanic activity in the open ocean. The unpopulated island is slowly colonized by animals, which gradually diversify into different species to exploit the whole area effectively. The classic example of evolutionary diversification is seen in the Galapagos Islands of the Pacific Ocean. Early in their history, a small finch arrived that subsequently evolved into tree-living, insect-eating forms, seed-eating forms with heavy bills, and a form that ate burrowing grubs wrinkled out with cactus spines. The large number of resulting species reflected the large number of ecological niches available on the islands. Birds, with their power of flight, are usually the first vertebrates to reach a new island, and consequently, far-flung islands can usually be counted on to produce a number of interesting bird fauna. Typical are the heavy flightless birds, such as the moa, dinornis of New Zealand, the dodo, rapus of Mauritius, and the elephant bird, apiornis of Malagasy. And I think that is also known as Madagascar, for those not in the know. Again, I wish this would never happen, but it always does. The intervening sea was an effective barrier preventing interbreeding between the far-traveled individuals that reached the island and the original stock back home. Such barriers to interbreeding are necessary in the evolution of new species. Races or subspecies often coexist in the same area, exploiting slightly different environments or food resources, but retaining the ability to interbreed. There may even exist a chain of subspecies reaching from one region to another, each subspecies able to interbreed with the one next to it, with the next one to it. When the species at the ends of the chain are quite different, the chain is called a cline. Occasionally, a cline may form a ring, for example, round a mountain range, where two end members, although next to one another and related, are so different that no interbreeding is possible and are, technically speaking, different species. This poses problems in taxonomy since, as interbreeding is possible elsewhere throughout the ring, the members must strictly be considered the subspecies of the same species. Taxonomy is generally just a mess. Once a group becomes isolated from its original population, it may develop on its own to such an extent that if the isolating barrier later disappears and the two populations once more intermingle, interbreeding is no longer possible. They are now, by definition, two different species. The differences are accentuated if the new location the isolated group finds itself in is basically unsuitable. The group will very quickly disappear, except for maybe a few individuals at the extremes of the species range that show some slight affinity for the environment. The species that then develops will be descended from those few individuals that were genetically different from the main population in the first place, and contained, by chance, genetic traits that made them more innately likely to survive. Because organisms are capable of infinite variability and have an inherent tendency to change when set in an unstable environment, new species appear more rapidly when the environment is changing quickly. Evolution is so efficient that no ecological niche is left vacant for long. Something will always develop to fill it. Now, efficient seems like it would be correct, again, if you look at it from an old point of view, but really, evolution is fluid. That's all it is. It's not efficient. It's fluid. In modern understanding, I'm setting the book aside because I need to refill the cat's water dish with some of my water, I think. I like to share. There we go. So that's probably the better way to look at it, because to say evolution is efficient implies that it has a goal, which it doesn't. So fluid may be the better term here. There we go. At the time of man, a chain of subspecies, or cline, existed around the North Pole with the British lesser black-backed gull, Larus fuscus grailsi, that's hard to say, and the British herring gull, Larus argentatus, as end members. All neighboring species of the cline could interbreed with one another, excepting the end members, which, by the time the chain was complete, were too distantly related to mate with one another successfully. 1. The British lesser black-backed gull. Larus fuscus graelsi. The Scandinavian lesser black-backed gull, Larus fuscus fuscus. The Siberian vega gull, Larus argentatus vegae. American herring gull, Larus argentatus smithsonianus. And the British herring gull, Larus argentatus argentatus. Now, I'm going to very quickly look something up because I'm not sure if an evolutionary decline is still a thing. Looks like it still is. Also known as a ring species. So it is very much a thing. All right. I presumed it was, but, you know, better safe than sorry there. Anyway. And then I will show you the diagrams after this. From the original finch that arrived on the Galapagos Islands from South America, around 15 separate species evolved to fill the island's vacant ecological niches. Each species with specialized characteristics suited to its own individual diet. The finches fall broadly into three distinct groups according to habitat: cactus, tree, and ground dwellers, and differ mainly in the shape of the bill. It is thought that to begin with, birds were scarce on the island, allowing the finches to evolve forms suitable for all the environmental slots available. Modern research has now identified the gene that produces the different shapes of bill in the Galapagos finch. That's an example of the new research coming in. And the new writing is actually quite distinct. I was worried that it wouldn't be distinct enough, but it's like going from bold to not bold in most forms of font that you would use. So, a Platyspeza crassirostris, a Cactuspeza heliobates, Camarorhynchus parvulus, Camarorhynchus pauper, Pinnaroxolius inornata, Certhadia oliviacea, Geospeza fortis, Geospeza magnorostris, Geospeza fulginosa, Geospeza conerotris, and Geospeza scandens, and the ancestral finch in the middle. So you can see the examples of what was being talked about: the finches and the ring species and the gulls. Animal behavior. This is one of those things that is constantly changing, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was also quite outdated. Evolution does not involve the conscious will of the organism. Not always. Nor does it happen through any adaptation that is forced on it by its surroundings, or any strategy learned by the organism during its lifetime being passed on to it by its evolution. It happens, simply, because certain characteristics in an organism's genetic makeup are either selected for or selected against by the particular characteristics of the environment in which it finds itself. The environment, in this context, is the physical surroundings of the organism, such as the topography, the temperature, the rainfall, and the other organisms that coexist with it, both those that it feeds on and those that feed on it. The rate of evolution has little to do with the rate at which genetic mutation occurs. The important factor is the environment's rate of change, the speed at which new pathways open up to which new forms may evolve and develop. That might be out of date. Unfortunately, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm an evolution aficionado, if anything. As well as being responsible for structural and morphological traits in an animal, the genetic makeup of a cell also gives rise to behavioral traits that allow an animal to interact with its neighbors and with its environment in a way that ensures its survival. It can be argued that the function of an organism is merely to pass on its genes to the next generation. Evidence to support this can be drawn from patterns of behavior seen in animals. Behavior is simply an animal's active response to its environment, and along with growth and reproduction is one of the factors that defines a living being. Birds crowd together when a hawk appears, thus making it more difficult for the hawk to seize an individual. Running herbivores dodge about to escape a swifter predator so that it becomes exhausted before catching any of them. Taking a quick break there to move on to the next diagram. The visual courtship display of birds is an important part of a behavioral pattern that also includes song. Male bird song is designed to attract females as well as deter rival males. Visual identity or visual display may take place independently with the intention of attracting a mate. An individual, usually a male, postures and signals until it has secured the attentions of a potential mate. The pair then display in concert, each responding to the other's gestures with the object of discovering the other's willingness or readiness to mate. Many species rely on resplendent plumage for display. In most cases, the males are ostentatiously feathered, whereas the females are drab by comparison. Not in all cases, mind you. Sometimes it's actually the opposite. The movements and gestures in courtship display are usually those associated with aggression or appeasement. In some species, preening and mock sleep are all part of the display. A. Gannic, Morus basanus. B. Sage grouse, Centrocercus orophacianus. I may have said that wrong. I may say some of these wrong. Latin is not my first language. C. Cormorant, Phallocrocrax carbo. B. The Brolga crane, Grus rubicunda. E. Great crested grebe, Podiceps cristatus. And F. Adelie penguins, Pygoscelis adeliae. See here, all of them lovely examples of courtship displays in birds. That word is described, of course. Young birds stay close to their mothers until they are mature enough to fend for themselves. These, like all aspects of behavior, have evolved to aid survival. A gene that introduces a behavior pattern that does not contribute to the survival of the species is soon eliminated. A little bit of a harsh thing to say. If it's actively harmful, yes, but a neutral behavior, like scratching against a tree or whatever. There's no binaries. There's always a spectrum, and most of the time, behaviors are going to fit squarely in the middle. And animals are not going to necessarily do things strictly for survival. There are things that they do that don't really seem to have a purpose. Crows tobogganing off the side of a roof, or every once in a while you run into animals making mistakes. It happens. It happens in nature. In a fight, moose get their antlers locked together. A giraffe might be running from lions or something and get its head stuck in a tree and break its neck. Monkeys misjudge and fall out of trees. Mistakes happen, and animals are not strictly focused in a singular direction. And part of this is because this is old science, but it's worth me popping out of the book every once in a while to correct these things because, well, modern evolutionary understanding is that, birds are intelligent, mammals are intelligent. They may make mistakes, but they don't necessarily have to make behaviors that are 100% focused strictly on survival. Sometimes they just do things because they want to, and they can. Goats climb trees, yes, to get food, but also because they can. And goats are stubborn. Believe me, if you've never met a goat, trust me, they're stubborn. Courtship rituals are a very complex aspect of behavior. The exact motion of a bird in a display dance, or the movement of a lizard's head as it approaches a prospective mate indicates to its future partner that it is in breeding condition and that it is a member of the correct species. The latter point is important, for although mating between two related but separate species may produce offspring, they will almost certainly be sterile. Such matings are a total waste of time and effort from the point of view of evolution, as they do not successfully propagate the creature's genes and are therefore to be avoided. Ligers being the primary example that immediately comes to mind, or mules. These activities are all instinctive hereditary behavior patterns. Other behavior patterns are learned and are also ultimately derived from the animal's genetic makeup. The ability to establish the appropriate reaction by trial and error, or by the example of others around it, is an ability conferred on an animal by its genes. Aggression is an element of behavior that is perhaps more complicated than it first appears. One might ask why, if the object of aggression is to remove one's competitors, do not animals fight to the death each time there is a conflict? Apart from the obvious risk involved, the answer is probably that, as an animal has no chance of killing all its potential rivals, by killing an isolated one, it is just as likely to assist its competitors as to benefit itself. In most cases, combat in the animal world takes the form of mock battles and aggressive displays, which do little physical damage to the creatures involved, but do establish the dominance of one or other of the participants. Thus, the animal that wins a contest achieves what it has set out to do, that is to gain or retain the resource in dispute without suffering injury itself. Plus, injuries are pretty costly. It can be pretty costly in nature, especially if you live on your own, so... The loser also derives benefit in that he escapes serious injury and retains the possibility of contesting future issues, where he may eventually be successful. It is difficult to see how the strategy could be learned, and it is more likely that it is the product of evolutionary development. Those animals adopting the strategy are more likely to reproduce, and therefore the genes responsible for the behavior are passed on in preference to others that results in less successful behavioral patterns. Or, self-preservation instinct is a thing. If you can't avoid a fight, it would be smart to do so. Throughout the animal kingdom, behavior patterns are designed to ensure the survival of the individual's genes rather than the survival of the individual. Loyalty is shown to the closest relatives, since the closer the relative, the larger the number of similar genes in its makeup. The protective instinct, which causes a mother bird to put itself in danger or even sacrifice its life in order to save its brood, is a behavioral trait calculated to promote the survival of its own genes. As the genes of the mother bird are present in the brood, and the several members of the brood have a better chance of reproducing and spreading their genes than has the single parent bird, it is to the advantage of her own genes to preserve the lives of her chicks, even at the expense of her own. Less obvious is the gene survival behavior of social insects such as bees and ants. A member of such a group will fight to the death indiscriminately to ensure the survival of the colony. In this case, members of the colony are much more closely related to one another in genetic makeup than are the other animals within a single breeding population. The survival of the colony, therefore, ensures the survival of the individual's genes despite the death of the individual. Many mating ploys, particularly those seen in birds, may seem to actually reduce the individual's chance of survival rather than to increase them. The breeding plumage of many male birds, as well as being attractive to a mate, makes them visible to predators. Birds possessing particularly long and spectacular tail feathers must find them a great disadvantage when escaping from a predator. Spoiler alert, that's true. It is possible such handicaps of survival may be devices to show just how successful the male is. If he can survive with all that working against it, then it must be good. Hence, the female is instinctively attracted to the male that puts on the most extravagant display. Alright, here's a few other examples. Investigations into the song of the chaffinch, Fringilla coelebs, has provided a fascinating insight into the role of learning in behavior. It was found that, as indicated on the sound spectrograph shown opposite, that young chaffinches reared in isolation were capable of only a rudimentary song, and that to produce the fully developed form, they had to first hear the song of others in the wild. I mean, instinctively we can all make a noise, but you can learn a language, as an example. Male fiddler crabs, Yucca subspecies, attract males by waving their large fiddle claws. The gestures they make, both in the shape of the movement and in the speed, varies between species living in the same area and ensure that only females of the correct species are attracted. as only matings between individuals with the same species are likely to produce fertile offspring. Those males not possessing the genes that produce the correct waving patterns are likely to disappear. Examples provided, as you do. I'm sorry, this is taking so long for us to get to the cool animal things. We've got, I assure you, it won't be too much longer. Oh, there's a whole history of life section. Okay. So this looks to be relatively basic things and stuff. There's 18. What was that? In any event, there's quite a few more pages here. There's like 14 more pages that are based off of this sort of thing. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to skip things like form and development, food chains, the history of life, the origins of life, early living forms, the age of reptiles. Skip most of the stuff that you probably would have learned in school, if you have learned it in school. If you haven't learned it in school yet, we will come back to that, I think, because the real point of this book, alongside teaching evolutionary principles, is to talk about the weirdos that you see on both covers here, and how they evolved. So to get to the story, where I'm going to, just to pick up the pace a little bit, I'm going to do that. But I'm going to leave in the polls whether you want to see me double back or end it, or save that for another time. So I'm just going to throw up this poll really fast. I don't see it anywhere, but if you guys can see it, that's great. Do you want me to double back, or do you want me to take care of that at a later time? I'll keep that up for most of it until I see a pretty decent chunk of viewers voting, and then we will be well on our way. So we'll skip most of that and just go right into the Age of Man, because that's where the book really gets started on its future stuff, which is presumably what you're here for. I apologize it took us 75 plus minutes to get here, but it is what it is. And keep in mind, again, the language is old. The first men were plant gatherers and animal hunters, and differed little in lifestyle from the other herbivorous and the carnivorous animals around them. They had sufficient intelligence to devise tools and weapons and a social organization that made hunting and food gathering more efficient. Neither of these things, however, made any serious impact on the environment. The first great change in their lifestyle came when, instead of hunting and gathering animals, they brought them together and looked after them in a single location. This eliminated the element of danger present in hunting and reduced the probability of starvation, as there was no longer the possibility of returning empty-handed from a foraging expedition. It was the beginning of agriculture. At first, the areas under cultivation were small and relatively insignificant. However, the improvements to early man's way of life were so dramatic that his populations increased markedly, and more land had to be cleared of its natural vegetation to make room for crops and grazing animals. As man's ingenuity and tool-making ability grew, he invented industrial processes that could produce tools with greater speed and less trouble than before. This inevitably involved heat, and forests were cut down to supply wood, and mountainsides were dug away to reach coal to provide fuel. Within a few thousand years, the landscape of the earth was changed out of all recognition. man's knowledge grew, most significantly in the field of medical science. Accidents and diseases that helped to keep natural populations in check were overcome or reduced in their effects by man's endeavors. Genetic defects that, in the wild, would have proved fatal and would have been eliminated by natural selection were perpetuated because their possessors were allowed to live and reproduce. Again, keep in mind, some of this language is old. World population increased exponentially, and hardly a region of the Earth's surface remained untouched by man. I want to bring this up specifically about the medicine bit. Accidents were always reduced in risk of death. Diseases, not so much, but really, social animals always had a chance to reduce the injuries of accidents. I mean, lions that would have starved to death if it weren't for other members of the pride bringing food back to them, for instance, or humans that needed time to recover from, say, a broken leg, that would not have been able to do so if it wasn't for the members of the group. This is the big major benefit of groups. Plus, in recent years, we have learned that ants can take care of each other. Like, there are species of ants that have paramedics, basically. So this attitude that that medicine allowed for genetic defects to progress and be successful, and that is why we have all of these crazy genetic defect things. It's kind of harsh and also not entirely true. It's much more complicated than this, as is true with a lot of the evolutionary stories throughout this, that it takes a while to explain everything. So you simplify it, but in simplifying, you lose some very important context every once in a while. This is an example of that. So I seriously doubt that Dougal Dixon was basically calling for eugenics in this book. So don't jump on his ass for that. But it is worth bearing in mind that in simplifying things, you miss out on some crucial details. Hello, cat. It's just something to keep in mind. The ultimate effect was that whereas other animals change and adapt through the slow process of evolution to fit into their environment, man was able to change his environment to suit his current needs, reaping a short-term advantage in the process. Living outside evolution, not quite true, each stage in his rapid cultural development was passed on to the next generation, not through his genes. Hey, don't bite me. Or did you want pets that badly that you needed to bite me for that? Ow. Anyways, not through his genes, but by learning. Although he avoided the unpleasant effects of natural selection-ish, he also did without its long-term benefits, and in short, called a halt to evolution as it applied to himself. Again, evolution never stops, it just slows down a lot in this case. Yes, cat. The result was a world overburdened by a population of beings unable to survive without their own conscious intervention, a world given over to the essential needs of man, a world poisoned by his waste. Ultimately, the earth could no longer supply the raw materials needed for man's agriculture, industry, or medicine, and a shortage of supply caused the collapse of one structure after another. His whole complex and interlocking social and technological edifice crumbled. Man, no longer able to adapt, rushed uncontrollably to his inevitable extinction. This is quite a bleak look, and as noted earlier in the book, this was taken to quite an extreme, because I don't know about you, but being able to alter the environment to suit your own needs is a pretty powerful tool of evolution, and humans are very, very, very adaptable creatures. So I don't think we would ever strictly go extinct directly. A more likely scenario could be that mankind has to leave Earth and get out and not come back. But same basic idea. With the dominant life form gone, the animal world entered a period of evolutionary chaos that lasted tens of thousands of years. However, man's extinction provided the impetus for the formation of many new species of animals, and his disappearance was of fundamental importance in shaping the world that emerged 50. Hey, cat! I was trying to help you. He had his claws stuck in my long johns, so I tried to help him, and he goes and tries to bite me. Meanie. In any event, ape, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Cro-Magnon, Homo sapiens. Again, a lot has changed when looking at human evolution in the last 40 years. Cro-Magnon is us, people. Life after man. The world 50 million years after man is one he would still recognize. The climate and vegetation are broadly similar, only the geography has changed. Plate tectonics, the force responsible for continental drift, has driven the continents of Eurasia, Australia, and North America together, and turned South America into an island. The animals, on the other hand, although still falling into the similar classes of fish, mammals, reptiles, and so on, are remarkably different, even though there are, in most cases, underlying similarities between them and the species that man would have known. The most profound differences are in the higher forms of life, old language, the birds and mammals, which, because of their adaptability, respond rapidly to changing environmental conditions by evolving and producing new species quickly. As the Earth's major inhabitants are broadly unchanged, they cannot be responsible for the changes that have occurred in the Earth's fauna since the time of man. The answer must lie more with the infinite variability of nature and the large number of solutions that exist in terms of form and shape of any one animal in a given environment. Which solution is ultimately adopted bears strongly on the animal's ancestry. If a creature has a particular feature that, in the short term, can be modified to suit a certain role, then that feature will develop in the course of evolution to suit the purpose and preference to one that is hypothetically better, but would have had to have evolved from scratch. Again, evolution works with what it has most of the time. The vacuum created by the demise of man provided the stimulus that led to the creation of this new fauna, and it is their solutions to the successful exploitation of Earth's vast variety of habitats that is described on the following pages. Again, bearing in mind, Dougal, I guess for the sake of simplicity, kept Earth relatively the same, climatically wise, but having an Earth that looks like this is going to be climatically different from an Earth that looks like it is now, especially with humans out of the picture. So these animals could have even become more wild than he imagines. So that's part of the charm of new wave spec evo, I guess you could say, where nothing is really off limits. Everything counts. Again, very nasally. I don't know why I always produce mucus when I talk so damn much. It happens to me when I read when I read other books as well, aloud. That diagram, by the way, 50 million years after the age of man, the world's northern continents of Africa, Eurasia, and North America have joined with Australia to form a single unit. South America is separated from North America as it was in the Tertiary. Old timey-wimey. Here's a map of the world 50 million years after man. You can see it up here. This is Earth today. This is Earth 25 million years in the future. And this is Earth 50 million years in the future. All the different zones are highlighted. I will throw up the label now. Unfortunately, it looks like focus is going to be rude. So I will read off the colors for you guys. Purple, tundra and the polar regions. Dark green, coniferous forests. Lighter green, temperate woodlands and grasslands. Bluish green, tropical forests. Orange, tropical grasslands. And yellow are deserts. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what things kind of look like on this planet. Temperate woodlands and grasslands. Across the northern hemisphere, the temperate woodlands and grasslands form a broad belt encircling the globe, interrupted only by high mountains and seas. South of the equator, temperate habitats are only found in isolated pockets, highlighted here on this Earth map in green. Temperate woodlands and grasslands are characteristic of middle latitude areas, where warm subtropical and cool subpolar air masses meet. This boundary is not fixed but moves north and south with the seasons and varies a great deal according to the geography and relief of the region. In the lower temperature latitudes, the western edges of the continents tend to have hot, dry summers and mild, damp winters. Excuse me, by the way. While the eastern edges are warm and humid all the year round with frequent summer thunderstorms. In higher latitudes, the cool subpolar air masses are the more dominant influence, and the general eastward movement of the air brings rain to the western margins, giving damp, humid conditions in both summer and winter. The typical vegetation in humid areas is deciduous forest, but in places where the rainfall is high and there is little difference between summer and winter temperatures, evergreen forests of both coniferous and broadleaf trees are found. Most of the tree species present are influenced by soil type and local relief. Pines are found on gravelly soils and rock outcrops, and alders and willows on waterlogged soil by streams, rivers, and streams. But the main types of tree are oak, ash, maple, and beech. The characteristic feature of deciduous woodland is the difference between its summer and winter aspects. In the summer, the leaves form an almost continuous canopy, and little direct sunlight reaches the ground. After the annual shedding of leaves, the trees stand stark and naked against the wintry skies, and the inhabitants are faced with new conditions of lighting and cover, as well as temperature and precipitation. They react to this in many ways, including hibernation and migration. The discarded leaf matter forms a thick, rich soil. It contains three sources of plant nutrients: rotting plant material, humus, and clay minerals. Humus slowly releases nutrients into the soil and also traps essential minerals such as nitrates and phosphates. The clay minerals store potassium, sodium, and calcium, important raw materials necessary for photosynthesis. In areas of seasonal rainfall, where the total precipitation is between 25 and 75 centimeters, grass forms the dominant vegetation. Although all grassland areas have an annual period of drought lasting several weeks or months when the surface soil dries out completely, their fundamental characteristic is the total absence of moisture at depth in the soil. The lack of water at this level does not impede the growth of grass, which is shallow-rooted, but prevents trees, which have deep roots, from establishing themselves. The timbered woodlands and grasslands probably represent the habitats that suffered most during the age of man some 50 million years ago. Man cut down the forests to supply fuel and to provide space for agriculture and settlement. He plowed large tracts of grassland to plant cereals and created wide expanses of pasture land for grazing animals. These disturbed areas did not revert to their natural state until a long time after man's disappearance. This interference caused the extinction of a great number of animal genera native to the original habitats. However, some creatures did survive, and it is from these that the animals of today's temperate woodland areas are descended. Here we go. The rabucks. Now we're getting into the fun stuff. The evolution of the major group of herbivorous animals. During the period immediately before and during the Age of Man, the principal large-scale grazers and browsers were the ungulates, the hoofed mammals. They were generally lightly built running animals, able to escape quickly from predators and with teeth particularly suited to cropping leaves and grasses. The ungulates were widely used by man for his own purposes. Cows and goats were domesticated for milk and meat. Sheep were bred for wool, and the skins of many were used for leather. Horses and oxen were harnessed to work for man and became the classic beasts of burden. By the time man became extinct, these animals had become so dependent on him that they could no longer survive. The deer, the wild ungulates of the temperate latitudes, fared little better. Vast tracts of temperate woodlands had been destroyed to make room for man's cities and to provide agricultural land. This interference with their habitat was so intolerable and put such pressure on the deer that their numbers fell to a level from which they never recovered. What then could take their place? A whole ecological niche was vacant, with nothing to exploit it. What creature was best suited to take the initiative? During the Age of Man, a small-scale grazer was present that was so successful that it was considered to be a pest. The rabbit was so seriously destructive of man's crops that man made numerous attempts to control it and even attempted to exterminate it. Yet, no matter what actions he took, he never succeeded in getting rid of it completely. After man's disappearance, the rabbit's versatility and short breeding cycle enabled it to develop successfully into a number of separate forms. The most successful, the rabuck ungulagus subspecies, now occupies the niche left by the ungulates. To begin with, the rabuck changed little from its rabbit ancestors excepting for size. In an environment totally devoid of large, hoofed grazing animals, the rabbit was left with no major grazing competitors and quickly evolved to occupy the position they once held. The early rabuck, macrolagus subspecies, retained the hopping gait of their forebears and developed strong hind legs for leaping. However, although jumping was ideal for moving around the open grasslands, their traditional habitat, it was not the best method for the confined spaces of the forest, and a more fundamental change had to take place. Several species of this earlier line still exist, but their place has largely been taken by the running forms of rabuck that more closely resemble the deer of earlier times. The second major development took place some 10 million years after the age of man. As well as developing rapidly into the size of a deer, the rabucks also began to evolve the typical deer leg and gait. The jumping hind limbs and the generalized forelimbs of the rabbit grew into long, shanked running limbs, and the feet changed radically. The outer digits atrophied, and the second and third toes grew into hooves, strong enough to bear the animal's weight. This was a highly satisfactory arrangement, and this line has now largely replaced the leaping form as the dominant group. The rabuck has been so successful that it is found in a wide variety of forms throughout the world, from the tundra and coniferous forests of the far north to the deserts and rainforests of the tropics. We're going to go to the earlier page so that I can show you rabucks! Look at these guys! They are rabbit deer! Aren't they great? I'm kind of surprised that they never turned this into a Pokemon, given how popular this franchise was in Japan. So, we have, I'm not going to say their Latin names because I need to actually see them in order to read it. Desert rabuck, common rabuck, mountain rabuck, and Arctic rabuck. So, the desert rabuck is Ungulagus flavus. The common rabuck is Ungulagus silvicultrix. The mountain rabuck is Ungulagus scandens, and the Arctic rabuck is Ungulagus hirsutus. A much more lightly built creature with long ears and a short sandy-colored coat, the desert rabuck stands no more than 1.2 meters high at the shoulder and is found in arid areas throughout the world to the south of the temperate belt. This, the mountain rabuck, is the smallest and least common of all rabuck species and is found along the western mountains of the northern continent. It is adapted to live on a meager diet of poor grasses and herbs. Heavily built with rolls of insulating fat, the Arctic rabuck is found in the far north, in the region of tundra and coniferous forest. Jeez, I wish my nose would stop doing that. The Arctic rabuck has a thick, hairy coat, which turns white in the winter. The forest-dwelling rabuck of the temperate latitudes is the archetypal species of the genus Ungulagus. It grows to around 2 meters high and has a dappled coat, which camouflages it effectively among the trees. They are normally found in small herds in between 10 and 12 individuals. Keep in mind, 2 meters high is over 6 feet tall at the head. That's taller than me. These rabbit deer are bigger than I am. So, the more you know. Other things. Several species of hopping rabuck, macrolagus subspecies, still survive. This evolutionarily older group consists largely of woodland animals that feed on the leaves and shoots of trees. The hopping rabuck moves in a bounding motion, A, B, C, D, reminiscent of its rabbit ancestors, whereas the running form, Ungulagus subspecies, moves in a manner similar to that of the ancient deer, E, F, G, and H. The development of the foot from the large springboard structure of the rabbit to the light two-toed running hoof of the rabuck was crucial to its evolution. The 3 principal stages are shown here, although not to scale. Well, of course not, because again, the common roebuck is huge. But here's some examples of the diagrams in mind: the evolution of the foot, what hopping roebucks look like, how they move, A, B, C, and D. I think. Oh, I got that backwards. A, B, C, and D, and then E, F, G, and H for how they run. I apologize for some reason. The YouTube live stream is actually mirrored, so that's weird. I'll have to figure that out later. The predators. The rise of the predator rats. The Earth's principal carnivore group. If you guys don't like rats, you're not going to like these guys. In the mammal world, the predators were traditionally carnivores, member of the order Carnivora, specialized meat-eating animals with teeth modified for stabbing, killing, and tearing flesh. Their legs were designed for leaping and producing a turn of speed that could quickly bring their chosen prey within killing distance. Wolves, lions, saber-tooths, stoats. These were the creatures that fed on the docile herbivores that it kept their numbers in check both during and before the age of man. However, being very specialized, these species tended not to have a great lifespan. They were so specialized and they were so sensitive to changes in the nature and the populations of their prey that the average life of a carnivore genus was only 6.5 million years. That's still not bad. They reached their acme just before the age of man, but have since decreased in importance and are now almost extinct, except for a number of aberrant and specialized forms found in the Coniferous Forests of the far north and in the South American island continent. The place of the carnivores, as the principal mammal predators, is now occupied by a variety of mammal groups in different parts of the world. In temperate regions, the descendants of the rodents occupy this niche. When the carnivores were at their peak, the rodents, particularly the rats, began to acquire a taste for meat and animal waste. The spread of man to all parts of the world encouraged their proliferation, and after man's demise, they continued to flourish in the refuse created by the disruption and decay of human civilization. It is this adaptability that has ensured their survival. Despite the specialized nature of their teeth, rats were able to live on a wide range of foods. At the front of their mouths, they had two sharp gnawing incisors, which continued to grow throughout life to compensate for wear and which were specialized by a gap from the back teeth. These were equipped with flat surfaces for grinding vegetable matter. This is very different from the typical predator dentition, which had cutting incisors in the front, followed by a pair of stabbing canines and a row of shearing teeth at the back. As the rats expanded to occupy the niches left by the dwindling carnivores, their teeth evolved to fulfill their new role. The gnawing incisors developed long stabbing points that were equipped with blades that could cut into and grip their prey. The gap between the incisors and the back teeth became smaller, and the grinding molars became shearing teeth that worked with a scissor action. To make the dentition effective, the jaw articulation changed from a rotary grinding motion to an up and down action. Instead of, you know what I mean? It feels weird to move your jaw like that. Where did that go? This dentition was crucial in the development of the predator rats and allowed them to radiate into the numerous forms of varieties seen throughout the world today. In temperate latitudes, the larger herbivores, the grazers and browsers of the plains and forests that were one time prey to the wolf, have now become the prey of the phalanx, Amphimorphodus cynomorphus, a very dog-like rat which hunts in packs. The evolution of this form involved the modification of the limbs, from the fairly generalized scampering legs of the rat to very sophisticated running organs with small, thickly padded feet and long shanks powered by strong muscles and tendons. So before we get over to the predator rat, to the phalanx itself. Let's talk about the three other kinds of predator rats that are here. The rapide, Amphibomorphus longipes, a native of the northern plains, is built for speed. Its highly flexible spine gives it the added impetus to reach speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour. For context, That's 62 miles per hour. That's pretty fast. That's like knocking on cheetah speed. The genus had Viverrinus brevipes is a long-bodied burrowing predator, strongly resembling the extinct stoats and weasels, and like them will swim, climb trees, and tunnel underground in the pursuit of its prey. The ravine, Vulpenimus ferox, is about the size of the extinct fox, or wildcat, and preys upon small mammals and birds. It has long claws and pointed stabbing fangs. The phalanx is the commonest species of predator rat found in the temperate forest. The dentition of the ancestral rat, consisting of gnawing incisors, front, and grinding teeth, back, reflects its herbivorous origins. The phalanx is the rabox's principal predators. They hunt in small packs, singling out the weaker individuals and harrying them to exhaustion. The phalanx is the largest member of the family. Although superficially dog-like in form, its rat ancestry is quite unmistakable. Phalanx. Look at these things, harassing this poor rabok. Yeah, no, if, I don't mind rats, but I wouldn't want these knocking on my door. Creatures of the undergrowth. Keep in mind my timer is to leave at about 6:30, so hopefully we can get through the whole thing, but we will see. Creatures of the undergrowth. Life beneath the trees and the broadleaf forests. Can you see why it took me so long to do parts of the audiobook? The undergrowth of a temperate wood, thick with humus and leaf litter, and added to annually by the autumnal shedding of deciduous leaves, provides a rich source of nourishment and shelter for all sorts of animals. The primary consumers of this material are bacteria and invertebrates, such as worms and slugs, which in turn provide food for many mammals and birds. The insectivores are therefore well represented in this habitat, not only in their primitive role of small insect eater, but also in the number of varieties that have adopted a predatory carnivorous mode of life. Among those that have kept their original lifestyle is the Testodon, Armatechnios impenetrabilis, a descendant of the primitive hedgehog. The spines of its ancestor have been replaced by a series of hinged, armored plates, which can be drawn together into an impregnable sphere when the animal is threatened. When rolled up tightly, it is almost impossible to grip or penetrate, and even the most determined predator rat finds a meal from this little animal more trouble than it is worth. The tusked mole, Scalpridens tapliform, comes somewhere between the old order of insectivorous animals and the newer carnivorous ones. Looking very much like a mole of 50 million years ago, it leads a burrowing existence and has adopted the streamlined shape, velvety fur, and spade-like feet of its distant cousin. However, here any resemblance stops. It has two huge tusks extending from its jaws and a paddle-shaped tail. As it burrows, the animal pushes forward with its feet in a rolling motion so that its tusks ream out the soil in front of it. The loose soil is pushed back by the feet and compacted into the tunnel walls by its tail. As well as eating worms and burrowing invertebrates, it also preys on small surface-living animals, especially mice, voles, and lizards. The most interesting example of a previously insectivorous creature turned meat-eater is the oak leaf toad, Gryma frondiform. It gets its name from a peculiar fleshy outgrowth on its back that looks exactly like a fallen oak leaf. This is that creature that was mentioned beforehand. We will see more later. The toad lies partly buried in the leaf litter, totally camouflaged and quite motionless except for its round pink tongue, which protrudes and wriggles about just like an earthworm. Any small animal that approaches to investigate falls victim to the toad's powerful jaws. The animal's only real enemy is the predator rat. These two creatures, the oak leaf toad and the predator rat, have a curious relationship. Within their bloodstreams lives a fluke, a kind of roundworm or flatworm, that spends the juvenile stage in the toad and the adult stage in the predator rat. When the fluke approaches adulthood, it produces a dye that turns the leaf-like outgrowth on the toad's back bright emerald green. As this happens in winter, the toad becomes highly conspicuous and is quickly eaten. In this way, the fluke is transferred into the body of the predator rat, where it becomes sexually mature and breeds. The fluke's eggs return to the toad through the predator rat's feces, which are eaten by beetles that are preyed on by the toad. As the fluke needs to spend a period of at least 3 years growing in the toad's body before it is ready to parasitize the predator rat, and the toad is sexually mature at 18 months, all toads have the opportunity of reproducing before being exposed to predation. The tusked mole's strong limbs and powerful tusks enable it to burrow through the hardest and stoniest soils. The tusked mole lies in wait just below the soil surface, listening for sounds of movement above. When it hears its prey approaching, it springs out, using its tail as a lever, grasping the animal in its teeth. The oak-leaf toad lures its prey with its long, worm-like tongue. Then we have the Testodon and the oak-leaf toad. When rolled up, the Testodon becomes a complete sphere. The Testodon has an overall length of 30 centimeters. The leaf outgrowth dyed green by mature fluke, and the untainted leaf growth providing camouflage. So, some examples shown here. The tusked mole from earlier on, and it launching at prey. We also have the oak-leaf toad catching a small rodent by surprise. And then we have the Testodon and the oak-leaf toad here. Now, bearing in mind, the oak-leaf toad, knowing now that the Testodon is a length of about 30 centimeters, the oak-leaf toad comes in at about 4 inches, which is quite average for many frog-like creatures. But just because it's average doesn't necessarily mean it isn't going to eat you, or eat you if you were a rat, a non-predator rat. The tree dwellers, mammals and birds of the treetops. Plant-eating mammals abound in the trees of the deciduous forest, eating shoots and leaf buds in the spring and fruits and nuts in the autumn. The long-bodied squirrel, known as the chirrut, Tendescurus rufus, is a typical plant-eating mammal. Its peculiar shape is a legacy from an immediate ancestor, the tree-burrowing rodent of the northern coniferous forests. As it spread south into the temperate woodlands, it found it no longer needed to make deep tunnels in the trees to escape the harsh winter, and as a result, the animal's specialized chiseling and gnawing teeth became smaller, its dentition reverting to be more like that of its distant ancestor, the gray squirrel. Its bodily shape, however, was still perfectly adapted for life in the trees and remains unchanged. Cool off my nose and drink. Now that the animal no longer led a burrowing existence, its legs and feet had to evolve to suit its new environment. Its hind feet, although small and short, became very powerful and developed strong gripping claws. The underside of its short tail grew hard and scaly, and with its hind feet formed a strong 3-point anchor that could secure the animal to the tree while it reached out to collect food. As its squirrel ancestors' jumping ability has completely disappeared, the animal can only move from one tree to another by reaching out and grasping an extended branch. For this reason, the chirrut is found most often in dense thickets, where the trees are close together. Its only enemies are birds of prey, and it is really only vulnerable to these when feeding in the topmost branches. It retains the predilection of the burrowing squirrel for making nests and holes in trees, and often occupies holes and hollows excavated by wood-boring birds. Wood boring is the specialty of a group of insectivores known as tree drummers, Proboscisconus subspecies. That's hard to say. I apologize. These animals, basically shrew-like in form, subsist on a diet of grubs and insects, which they gouge out from crevices in the bark. They have masses of sensory bristles on their feet and very large ears, which help them to detect the movement of grubs burrowing in the wood. When a tree drummer finds a grub, it drives its chisel-like teeth into the bark to make a hole big enough to enable it to remove a grub with its trunk-like proboscis. Sometimes the grub becomes skewered on its chisel teeth and needs to be carefully plucked off before being eaten. It is really the birds that are the masters of the trees, After the great reptiles became extinct over 100 million years ago, the ancestors of the birds, keep in mind, the birds expanded into an enormous number of species. Being primarily designed for flying, birds had access to the treetops in a way few other animals had, and finding that they were safer there than on the ground, they soon became perfectly adapted to this new habitat. As a result, many woodland birds have developed feet with curled opposable toes that were ideal for gripping branches. In one species, the tree goose or hanging bird, Pendavis bidactylus, these toes have been reduced to two. They are permanently curved and enable the bird to hang upside down without effort. Because of the bird's size and weight, this attitude is much easier to maintain over long periods than an upright stance, and it has taken to spending long periods roosting in this position. The chirrut moves forward in a series of loops and stretches reminiscent of a caterpillar. Solidly fixed to the tree by its hind feet and tail, the chirrut can reach out at almost any angle. Hard, leathery skin and scales cover the underside of the chirrut's hindquarters, which, by the way, the chirrut looks like this. How adorable. Then we have the tree drummer's feet are covered with sensitive bristles that can detect the slightest movement in the bark beneath. After making a hole in the bark with its chisel teeth, the tree drummer removes grubs with its bristle-tipped proboscis. Bristle. The tree goose or hanging bird in roosting position. That's these two. The tree drummer and the hanging bird. I think I call it a tree goose. Yeah, they call it a tree goose. This page feels thicker than the others, that's why it threw me off. Nocturnal animals, the nightlife of the temperate forest. Sorry. As night falls in the temperate woodland, the sleeping animals of the day are replaced by a completely new set of creatures. Nocturnal birds, bats, and insects. A whole array of creatures is found that are as diverse and numerous as those in the daytime. As dusk falls and the moths and night-active flies take to the air, the insectivorous bats appear to feed on them. Bats have proved so successful in their shape and lifestyle that in most parts of the world they have remained remarkably stable in shape and form ever since they first appeared over 100 million years ago. Save for the development of a more sophisticated echolocation system positioned at the front of the face and the absence of eyes, little else has changed. The purip bat, Coniferous species, so called because of its curious voice, is found throughout temperate latitudes. Unlike the earlier bats, which generally navigated through using high-pitched sound, the purip bat uses a much wider range of frequencies extending well into the audible level, giving it a much more sophisticated picture of the terrain. Great birds of prey, which combine the characteristics of the former eagles and owls, wing their way silently through the branches, ever watching for an unwary movement on the ground that would denote the presence of a small animal. Their large, forward-facing eyes, acting like wide-aperture lenses to increase the amount of light reaching the retina, give a three-dimensional image over their entire field of vision and enable them to accurately gauge distances and hunt in almost pitch darkness. Their prey includes the luti, Microlagus musops, a descendant of the rabbit. The lutis live in direct competition with the ancient groups of small rodents, the mice and voles. In some areas, the lutis have replaced the rodents completely, whereas in other parts of the woodlands, where the conditions particularly favor them, the rodents have remained successful. The lutis resemble the small rodents in many aspects, particularly in size, but their rabbit ancestry is obviously displayed in the shape of their head and tail. They feed mostly at night, nesting during the day in crevices among tree roots or in holes in the ground. Another small animal that provides food for birds of prey is the trutile, Terebrandus tuberus, an insectivore related to the chisel-toothed shrews of the trees. The incisors of both the upper and lower jaws of this animal are extended forward to form a structure like a bird's beak, which acts as a probe to catch worms and burrowing insects in soft earth and leaf litter. The true teal is completely blind and retains no vestiges of eyes. It is, however, equipped with a large number of sensory whiskers and extremely acute hearing. Its ears, which are enormous for the size of its body, can be rolled into trumpets by a unique set of muscles located at their base and then pressed to the ground to listen for the sounds of burrowing. The shrock, Melisonca sylvatus, is a much larger animal. Descended from insectivore stock, it has a size and shape comparable to that of the extinct badger. It makes nightly forays through the undergrowth and will take any prey that it chances upon. It has a long snout and broad forepaws, with which it digs after burrowing animals and excavates its own family nest in soft soil under tree roots. The Purip bat's sensitive ears are positioned far forward at the front of its face to provide it with the largest possible sound collecting surface. The shrock's outward similarity to the badger is an excellent example of convergent evolution. The largest of the owl-eyed predatory birds stands more than a meter high. That's over 3 feet tall. The lute's large rabbit-like ears betray its ancestry. The Purip bat's sonar equipment is typical of most temperate woodland bats. The true teal has an overall length of about 12 centimeters. The true teal uses its long beak to probe deep into the earth for grubs and worms. Worms and grubs. I said that backwards. So here's the true teal. There's the Purip bat. Here's the badger analog. I already forgot its name. The shrock. The face of the Purip bat, as you can see, no eyes. The lute, and the unnamed predatory bird. Also, what appears to be a really big moth, I just noticed, because if the true teals are 12 centimeters long, that's a pretty big moth. The wetlands! Life in the fens and marshes. In temperate latitudes, wetland areas are comparatively isolated pockets of land found scattered widely across the northern continent. As well as strictly water habitats such as ponds, lakes, and rivers, they also include stretches of salt marsh and fenland found near the sea, mires and peat bogs found in poorly drained inland regions, and areas of regular inundation. The conditions found throughout this range of habitats are so diverse in terms of salinity, oxygenation, light penetration, and water currents that very nearly every individual location has its own little ecosystem and associated fauna, and almost every animal group is represented. One of the most unusual water-living mammals is the frit. It's P-F-R-I-T. Very hard to pronounce. I'm going to call it the frit. The frit. Like a silent P. Frit. Aquilambulus hirsutus, a tiny insectivore descended from the primitive shrews. Its length, excluding its tail, is less than 5 centimeters, which puts it among the smallest mammals in existence. Although its body is thin, its feet and tail are broad and covered with water-repellent hairs, which spread its weight over such a large area that it can skate across the water without breaking the surface tension. It lives mainly on the larvae of mosquitoes and midges that are found just under the water's surface. It feeds on them by piercing their outer cuticles with its long hairless snout and draining them of their vital juices while they're still in the water. In this way, the frit avoids disturbing the water surface, which would both upset the surface tension and frighten away its prey. A mammal frequently found near riverbanks and lakesides is the reed stilt, Harundopus virgatus. Fun fact, the reed stilt was originally the cover animal for this book. Its long, slender legs and neck and vertical stripes render it almost totally invisible among reeds, where it is frequently found fishing. Its head and neck are most unusual. Practically all mammals have 7 neck vertebrae, but the reed stilt has 15. In evolutionary terms, the extra vertebrae have appeared quite recently, and result from the fact that, in fishing, longer-necked individuals have an advantage over the others. The tooth pattern is degenerate. The incisors, canines, and molars having all reverted to an almost reptilian condition in which they are all of the same shape. The reed stilt uses this combination of neck and tooth features to catch fish by darting out its long neck and snapping shut its needle-pointed teeth. Fishing skills have also been developed to a high degree by the angler heron, Butorides piscatorius. This bird, an inhabitant of the North American subcontinent, creates shallow ponds at the water's edge in the shade of overhanging trees by scraping at the river bottom and constructing shallow dams. On the shore nearby, it accumulates a heap of droppings and fish remains to attract beetles and flies. These it then picks up and drops into the mains to. Uh, 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 these it then picks up and drops into the shallow water to entice the fish into its pond, where they are easily caught. Although there are many examples of flightless birds, the long-necked dipper, Aterocynulus longinucus, a river bird of the European subcontinent, is the only bird that spends part of its life with the capacity for flight and the rest flightless. During its early life, the bird develops wings in the normal way, but once it has migrated away from its natal nesting site, it becomes totally earthbound and pursues a purely terrestrial aquatic existence. Its wings, now no longer necessary, lose their power and gradually atrophy. The lower parts of its legs are covered with hair and probably provide camouflage as well as protection. The reed stilt stands motionless in the water until a fish swims directly beneath it. Plunging its head into the water, it seizes the fish, straightens its neck, and swallows it, whole even. On its thin legs, the reed still stands at nearly a meter high at the shoulder, meaning that it, by the looks of it, reaches about 5 feet high at the head. The frit's feet are covered in fine hairs that prevent it from sinking in water. I will show you these two now. As you can see, the big guy is the reed stilt, the little guy is the frit, which, again, I'm not totally sure how you pronounce it, but I'm doing my best here. Just need to clear some notice. Then we have the frit's mouth extends forward into a long tubular snout, which carries a set of fine teeth at the tip capable of piercing the outer skin of an insect larva. Once the angular heron has baited his fish pond, it remains close by, watching, motionless from the reeds. The long-necked dipper. The wing of the breeding adult is degenerate and used only for balance and in swimming underwater. Schwip! There you go. Frit, the angler heron, and the long-necked dipper. The long-necked dipper. Thank you, book, for not closing on my fingers that time. Coniferous Forests. The coniferous forests of the northern continent represent the greatest expanse of uninterrupted forest in the world. Coniferous trees do well at high latitudes because they are evergreen, and photosynthesis can take place immediately conditions are right for growth without having to first produce leaves, as is the case for deciduous trees. In this way, conifers compensate for the short growing season, which is about 50 to 80 days depending on the latitude. Fruiting and reproduction are also in tune with the climate. Conifers, unlike deciduous trees, do not produce fruiting bodies that are pollinated and ripen within a single year. The fertilization of a female cone may take more than a year to complete, and as many as 3 more years may elapse before the cone matures and the seeds are ripe for dispersal. The lack of leaf litter and the prevailing cold conditions which inhabit the natural decay of the forest pine needle carpet, material that is slow to decompose in any case, results in only a thin underlying layer of topsoil and little to no undergrowth. The indigenous mammals are largely herbivorous and exist mainly on diets comprising mosses, pine needles, bark, and seed cones. Insectivorous birds are rare compared to those that feed on code seeds and buds. Throughout the region, forest fires are not uncommon, usually occurring in spring when the trees are low in sap. The large areas can be devastated at a time. Recolonization is firstly by deciduous trees such as birches, alders, and rowans that are only later replaced by the climatic vegetation of spruce, larch, cedar, or pine. The coniferous tree's typical tall, pointed shape is ideal for bearing the weight of the winter snowfall and allows the snow to be shed quickly when it melts in spring. Their surface-spreading root systems are perfectly adapted to the shallow soils that are characteristic of the habitat. In the north of the region, where the underlying soil is frozen all year and is therefore impervious to water, there are many lakes, streams, and bogs with their own localized flora of mosses and sedges. The forest is more open and blends into the neighboring tundra. Larger patches of tundra, Mosses and lichens appear on high ground. Near rivers in this transitional area, the forest remains thick and extends far northwards along sheltered valleys into the tundra. At the southern edge of the coniferous belt, the conifers grade imperceptibly into deciduous woodland. Throughout the world, smaller areas of coniferous forests are found outside of their normal longitudinal extent, particularly on the slopes of mountains, where the altitude produces climatic conditions similar to those experienced near the poles. During the Age of Man, the coniferous forests experienced considerable environmental damage, due mainly to clearance for agriculture and also in the course of commercial forestry. This effectively exposed large areas of land to the erosional effects of wind and rain, destroying the soil structure and consequently reducing its water retention capacity. The coniferous forests took some time to recover from this damage, for the normal success of recolonization could not take place immediately. Throughout the world, coniferous forests are found in areas having the lowest temperatures permissible for the growth of trees. The largest expanses are found at the far north of the northern continent, bordering the tundra. An example here, and where you would find said coniferous forests. The browsing mammals. The evolution of the hornheads. The browsers are the largest animals living in the coniferous forest regions. They feed primarily on young twigs and needles in the summer and subsist on bark, mosses, and lichens during the rest of the year. Across the northern continent, the most prolific species are those that are derived from the gigantelopes of the African subcontinent. We'll cross that bridge when we get there later. These northern animals, although much heavier than their distant antelope ancestors, are still not nearly as huge as the African gigantelopes. Only the shaggy tundra-dwelling forms of the far north are comparable in size with these. This difference in size between the two different northern forms is due to two separate periods of migration. The first took place around 40 million years ago, before the great mountain barriers between Africa and Europe were thrown up, and at about the time that the Rabak were ousting the antelope from its traditional home on the African plains. The gigantelopes, then at an early stage of evolution, were forced to spread northwards into the coniferous forest, where they later flourished and developed into the hornheads, Cornudens subspecies. The second migration took place more recently, about 10 million years ago, when the African gigantelopes had reached their present elephantine proportions. The erosion of the mountain chain that once separated the Indian subcontinent from the rest of Asia opened up new paths to the north and led to their gradual colonization of the tundra and the evolution of the woolly gigantelopes, Megalodorcus subspecies. Soon after their arrival in the coniferous forest, the ancestral hornhead's jaws and horns began to evolve in response to their new environment. In common with all the now almost extinct ruminants, most of these creatures possessed no upper incisor teeth. They cropped grass by working their lower incisors against a bony pad on the roof of the mouth. However, this system is not particularly effective for browsing from forest trees. The first change that took place was that the horny head plate became extended forward to form a sort of beak. The lower lip became muscular and grew forward to meet it, thus extending the mouth some distance beyond the front teeth. This fairly primitive arrangement is still found in several species, for example, the helmeted hornhead, Cornudens horridus. In more advanced forms, however, the lower jaw is also extended so that the lower front teeth meet the horny beak instead. These adaptations are the result of evolutionary pressure that enabled only those forms that could feed successfully on the twigs, bark, and lichens of the coniferous trees to survive. The elaborate horn formation above the eyes is also used for defense. The horn structure has been carried one stage further in the water hornhead, Cornudens rastrostrius, that inhabits lakesides and the banks of the rivers. In this creature, the horny plate extends forward into a broad rake-like structure, in which the animal grazes on soft water weeds that it finds on the beds of ponds and streams. It has two broad hooves on each foot, set widely apart and connected by a web of skin, which prevents the animal from sinking into the mud. The water hornhead, in this way of life, must surely resemble the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs of the latter age of reptiles. Which is funny, because most hadrosaurs didn't do that. This is an example of some of the things that were left outdated. Excuse me. A lot of the hadrosaurs actually lived in drier environments and may have only occasionally come down to water sources to eat. They would more come there to drink. So that comparison is outdated, but still a cool one nonetheless. You can compare it to actual waterfowl instead. Stop doing that, nose. Any hoodle noodle. The ancestral hornhead, Protocornidens, which existed between 35 and 40 million years ago, was smaller and more antelope-like in appearance. The horny head plate did not appear until some time later. The hornhead's horn formation grows gradually throughout adolescence and early adulthood, and in the case of the helmeted hornhead, takes its final form at around 3 years of age. The ornate horn structure plays an important part both in courtship and in male dominance struggles. The later hornheads, such as the common hornhead, have longer lower jaws and bite by bringing the lower incisor teeth into contact with the upper horn lip. Like its antelope ancestors, the helmeted hornhead, the most primitive surviving hornhead, bites by bringing its lower incisors into contact with a bony pad in the upper jaw. Hornheads stand about 2 meters high at the shoulder. Their horns, originally developed for a defensive role, have evolved since as browsing tools. The water hornhead's jaws, having become extended and broadened, are used for feeding on water plants. The ancestral hornhead, the helmeted hornhead fighting each other, 6 months, 1 year, or 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years for the helmeted hornhead, the water hornhead, and the helmeted hornhead. Oh, and the common hornhead as well. Interesting little arrangement. The hunters and the hunted. The relationship between predator and prey. As in all other habitats, the animals of the coniferous forest fall into the familiar food chain pattern of predator and prey, with the carnivorous animals forming the final link. Here, as in the temperate woodlands, the fiercest and commonest predators are the predator rats. They hunt beneath the trees in small packs, tracking down the rabbuck and the hornhead, singling out the weak and elderly individuals and running them to exhaustion. The predator rats take it in turn to attack, savaging their prey with powerful front teeth. Hornheads have such powerful horns that, when they are the quarry, it is almost as dangerous for the hunter as it is for the hunted. A predator unique to the coniferous forest is the pamphret, Vulpemustula acer, a large weasel-like creature and one of the few true carnivores still in existence. Its size, up to 2 meters in length, makes it by far the largest predatory animal found in the region, and it probably owes its survival to its low, powerful build and its ability to run through the sparse undergrowth easily, bursting out suddenly upon its prey. Pamphlets survive in small family groups and normally hunt in pairs. Not all the predators are mammals. Birds also kill their share of the small animal population. The broadbeak, Pseudofraga species, one of the larger birds of prey, has a wingspan of over a meter and lives in the western forests of the northern continent. It is descended from the starlings, which expanded to fill the gap left when many of the ancient predatory birds became extinct during the Age of Man. It has a rounded tail and broad, blunt wings, which enable it to fly swiftly and maneuver in the tight spaces between the trees. It has a straight, powerful bill and strong talons, which it uses to grip its prey. The broadbeak's closest living relative, Parovs lepidostris, is a totally different creature. It is only 10 centimeters long and lives mainly on insects that it extracts from the bark of trees with its thin beak. With so many predators in the coniferous forest, it is not surprising that the smaller mammals should have evolved such a variety of defense employs to ensure their survival. The spine-tailed squirrel, Humiscurius spinocaudatus, is an excellent example of their ingenuity. It has a long, broad, flat tail with quills developed on the underside, which when at rest, lie flat over the ground. However, when the animal is alarmed, it throws its tail over its back, and the sudden increase in skin tension arrests the quills. This presents an almost impenetrable barrier that can be turned to deflect an attack from either side. One large rodent that became adapted to a semi-aquatic way of life during the age of mammals, partially as a defense against predators, was the beaver. After man, the beaver, the castor subspecies, became even better adapted to life in the water. Its tail and hind feet have become fused together into one large paddle, which, when powered by the backbone, produces a powerful up and down swimming stroke. Its ears, eyes, and nose are placed high up on its head and remain above water when the rest of the animal is submerged. Surprisingly, the paddle does not impair the creature's movement on land and is used as a grasping limb, enabling it to climb partway up trees, increasing its potential supply for food and building materials. The combined rear limbs and tail of the modern beaver form an ideal structure for gripping a pine tree's rough bark. The modern beaver swimming stroke involves the whole body. Its family lodge, complete with underwater entrance, is built of sticks plastered with mud. Paraobs lepidostris. Although closely related to the broadbeak, it more nearly resembles their common ancestor, the starling. The broadbeak is the most massive predatory bird found in the coniferous forests. The spine-tailed squirrel places a barrier of quills between itself and the carnivorous pamphlet. So, modern beaver, future beaver, however you want to take that. Its swimming stroke, its lodge, the broadbeak, the Parops, which I am going to tentatively call the bark-boring starling, the pamphlet, and the spine-tailed squirrel. Quickly, rehydrate! And you should too. Tree life. Birds and mammals that feed on and in the trees of the coniferous forest. Down my face a little bit with cold water. There we go. Throughout the age of mammals, the rodents were one of the most successful animal groups in the coniferous forests. Their powerful teeth enabled them to cope with the tough vegetable matter found here, and their warm, furry coats helped them retain body heat during hibernation. The chiselhead, Tenebra vermiform, a rodent and a relation to the temperate woodland chirrut, is highly adapted to life in the coniferous forest. Its huge incisor teeth and worm-like body enable it to burrow deep into the living wood, where it can remain protected from the cold in winter. Although in some ways the animal is at an advanced stage of development, its parasitic way of life is really quite primitive. Its staple diet is the bark of the trees, which it strips off completely, leaving the tree totally denuded. This, combined with the massive damage it does by burrowing, kills the tree within a few years. As the chiselheads only colonize live trees, they must be continually on the move, and every spring after hibernation, the young of the new generation migrate to find new territories. During migration, they are very vulnerable, and many are taken by predators before they can complete the journey. The balance between burrower and predator is highly critical, and it needs only a slight reduction in the number of predators to produce an increase in the population of burrowers that will lead to the total destruction of vast areas of coniferous forests. No other small rodent found in the coniferous trees is quite so destructive. Most live on shoots, bark, and the seeds found in cones. Many are ground dwellers and feed from the cones where they fall. Others are lightly built and agile enough to scramble along the branches to where the cones are actually growing. One large vole-like rodent, the treble, Scandamus longicaudata, is unusual for having a prehensile tail. Too heavy to reach the cones growing on the slenderest branches, it feeds on them instead by hanging by its tail from a sturdy neighboring branch and reaching out with its front paws. Like other immediate needs like other rodents of this general size, it gathers more than is necessary for its immediate needs. It stores the rest for the lean winter months. Its hibernation nest is a long, drooping structure woven together from grass, strips of bark, and pine needles. Built hanging from the end of a branch, it is large enough to accommodate the animal together with sufficient food to see it through the winter. Of the many seed-eating birds found in the Coniferous Forest, the largest by far is the common pine chuck, Paraloxus targa. The two sexes of this species are quite different, both in appearance and in their mode of life. The male is much more powerfully built and is equipped with a massive beak, which it uses for breaking open pine cones to feed on the seeds. The female, much smaller and drabber, totally lacks the male's heavy beak and is really a scavenger, supplementing her diet with carrion, insects, grubs, and birds' eggs. Most probably, the common pine chuck's ancestor was a bird similar in appearance to the present-day female, and the male has evolved its own distinctive features primarily for display, and its eating habits are a secondary development. The male uses its heavy beak like a nutcracker to crush pine cones. The sexes of the common pine chuck are so different in appearance that they look like different species. The chiselhead gnaws through the living wood to make a home for itself deep inside the tree. So, some examples here. The common pine chuck, female and male, the trevelle, and the chiselhead. Each spring, the chiselheads select a new tree to construct a labyrinth of tunnels and nesting chambers in preparation for the winter. The chiselheads, deeply rooted incisor teeth, form effective burrowing tools. The trevelle's long clawed fingers and toes enable it to cling firmly to the bark of trees hanging by its tail. The trevelle can feed from cones growing in places that cannot be reached by animals of similar size and weight. Chiselhead damage and the trevelle in slightly better detail. Tundra and the polar regions. The bleakest places on the surface of the Earth are found around the North and South Poles, regions of constant ice and snow where no plants grow. Because of the tilt of the Earth, at certain times of the year, no sunlight whatsoever reaches these regions, and night lasts for months at a time. Even during winter, when daylight is continuous, the sun's rays hit the ground at such a shallow angle that very little warmth is felt. These conditions prevail both on the southern continent of Antarctica and on the ice mass that covers the northern polar ocean. The extent of the ice of the polar ocean is dependent on the low salinity of the Arctic waters. A saltier sea would not freeze over to such a degree. The polar ocean is separated from the Atlantic Ocean by a barrier of islands that inhibits their intercirculation. This island chain is formed from what was once a single island known as Iceland. It consisted of lavas that erupted from the mid-Atlantic ridge, and the crustal plates of Europe and North America moved away from each other. As the movement continued, enlarging the Atlantic Ocean, Iceland, straddling the mid-oceanic ridge, split into two parts, each moving in opposite directions. The continuing volcanic activity spawned a string of new islands in the growing gap between the two parts. Almost 180 degrees away, on the opposite side of the Arctic Ocean, the same crustal movements were responsible for closing the Bering Strait, the gap between North America and Asia, and fusing the two areas into one vast northern continent. As a result, the polar ocean is now practically landlocked and is fed by the rivers of the surrounding supercontinent. The generally low-lying areas fringing the polar ice sheets comprise the tundra. During winter, they are as cold and bleak as the Arctic wastes, but in summer, the temperatures rise above freezing and may reach an average daily temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. In the summer, the snow melts, but because of the permafrost, the layer of perpetually frozen soil beneath the surface, the water cannot drain away and floods the numerous hollows and depressions. Spring on the tundra is a time of spectacular change. A sudden bloom of vegetation bursts forth to the advantage of the brief growing season. Much of the vegetation reproduces asexually rather than by producing seeds, as is the case in warmer regions. Vegetative reproduction is much faster and therefore, because of the short summers, much more successful. Those plants that do reproduce sexually produce seeds that are highly resistant to frost. Mosses, lichens, and low bushy herbs are typical of tundra plants. The tundra vegetation's sudden summer flourish is accompanied by a bloom of insects and in spring, a veritable plague of flying creatures emerges to take advantage of the short period of warmth and sunlight. The seasonality of plant and insect life on the tundra means that for most mammals and birds, food is only available during part of the year, and most of the larger animals are consequentially migrant, spending the harsh winters to the south. In the southern hemisphere, there are no equivalent large land masses at latitudes that would produce a covering of tundra vegetation. The tundra that exists is found scattered on the islands of the Southern Ocean and on mountains just below the snow line. Tundra and Arctic habitats are found at both polar extremities of the globe and at the tops of high mountains. Conditions in these localities are broadly similar, and the habitats differ only in that one is an effect of latitude and the other of altitude. So, what a tundra would look like for those who have not been, and where these environments would be marked in purple. The migrants, the wandering herds and their predators. In comparison with other parts of the world, the animal and plant life of the tundra consists of a rather small number of species, each of which contains a relatively large number of individuals, a situation that is diametrically opposite of what is found in the tropics. The low species count is entirely due to the region's inhospitable conditions. All tundra animals have evolved from creatures found in more temperate areas. Their ancestors probably colonized the tundra only because they were driven to do so by fierce territorial competition. Life has to be unusually unpleasant elsewhere for a group of animals to venture into the tundra in the first place. During the summer months, the tundra is literally infested with flying insects and a large population of insect-eating birds. Many, like the pilophile, Phalurus, have bristled beaks, a ring of stiff hair-like feathers surrounding the beak that forms a cone and deflects insects into its mouth. The bristles, in effect, widen the bird's potential capture area and increase its food supply. For many large animals, the tundra is only habitable during the summer months, and in winter they migrate southwards into the coniferous forests, where conditions are less austere. The largest of these animals is the woolly gigantelope, Megalodorcus borealis, a close relation of the tropical gigantelope. It differs mainly in size and in the possession of a huge fatty hump, which provides it with nourishment during the hungry winter months. It has a long, shaggy winter coat and broad hooves, which prevent it from sinking into soft snow. It uses its enormous horns as snowplows to expose the mosses, lichens, and herbaceous plants on which it feeds. Its eyes its eyes are small to avoid being frostbitten, and its nostrils are bordered by blood vessels that warm the air before it reaches the lungs. In early summer, the woolly gigantelope loses its shaggy coat and takes on a much sleeker appearance. The hump which sustained it through the winter months is now entirely depleted, and it spends much of its time eating to rebuild its energy store for the long trek back south in the autumn. Because of the woolly gigantelope's size, 3 meters high at the shoulder without the hump, there are very few predators powerful enough to threaten it. Its only real enemy, the bardelot, Smilomys atrox, is a creature that would have been very much at home back in the first half of the Age of Mammals. At that time, elephants, animals of comparable size to the gigantelopes, were preyed on by saber-tooths. These creatures, members of the cat family, had long stabbing canine teeth with which they inflicted deep stabbing wounds on their quarry. After an attack, the saber-tooths would wait until the elephants bled to death before moving in to feed. This successful arrangement was even evolved independently among the marsupials. However, during the Age of Man, the elephants declined, and the saber-tooths, being entirely dependent on them, died out completely. I think this is an outdated hypothesis regarding how the saber-tooths did things. Just as advanced warning, I apologize, I just have to very quickly respond to family. There we go. With the advent of the gigantelopes, the saber-tooth pattern reappeared, but this time among the predator rats, because of course they did. Saber-toothed rats, fantastic. The Bardalot, unlike other members of the group, exhibits sexual dimorphism in that only the female is equipped with saber teeth and hunts the gigantelopes. The male, having none, resembles more the polar bears that once inhabited these latitudes. The pilophile's bristles extend its potential insect-catching area beyond the region of its head. When its beak is closed, the bristles drop down, allowing an uninterrupted forward vision, which is good because when you have the bristles out like this, I mean, my fingers are bigger than the bristles, I think, but it gives you an idea. In summer, the pilophile fades on the wing. In winter, it migrates south, shedding its bristles and growing in their place a long, probing bill. So I guess like the bill grows and then it shrinks and then some of that material goes into the bristles. Interesting. The pilophile's green and brown blotched egg is perfectly camouflaged in the tundra vegetation. And by the way, the pilophile looks like this. It's this little birdie over here. Male Bardalot, female Bardalot, I'll point that out later. Pouch for saber teeth. The female sabers are formed from the outer crowns of its two front teeth, a pattern derived from that of the predator rat. Woolly gigantelope with winter coat and fatty hump. The large forward-pointed horns are used to cleave snow from the vegetation in winter. The woolly gigantelope with a summer coat. Scruffy patches of white winter coat remain throughout most of the summer. So, as you can see, for instance, if we go here, here's a female Bardalot, here's a male Bardalot. There's that pouch that I mentioned earlier. And you can see in the wintry coat of the woolly gigantelope how long and shaggy it is compared to how relatively tight the summer coat is. The Meeching and its enemies, a compact ecosystem. As the constantly frozen ground of the tundra makes digging through the earth impossible, all small burrowing rodents found in the tundra are snow tunnelers. One tunneler in particular, the Meeching, Nyxocreatus lemimorphus, that's fun to say, has a very considerable effect on the ecology of the area. A colony of the Meechings may be started by as few as 3 or 4 individuals. They breed profusely, and as their numbers grow, they build a fortress of matted vegetable matter to protect them from the frosts and snows. The interior of the fortress is very complex and consists of a network of passages and tiny chambers, one for each individual. During the winter, each rodent is fully insulated and kept warm by the rest of the colony. As the population of the fortress increases each year, so does the local population of predators. The Meeching's principal predator is the polar ravine, Vulpelmus albulbus, a beast about the size of the extinct fox and very different from its temperate woodland cousin, V. ferox. It has a small head with tiny eyes and ears, an adaptation that prevents frostbite, and long, dull brown fur that turns white in the winter to camouflage it against the snow. It attacks the Meeching by digging into the fortress with its front paws. The Meeching's other enemies are mainly birds. The largest is the booty bird, B-O-O-T-I-E, not B-O-O-T-Y. Think little booties that you put on your feet versus booty that you'd find if you were working with a pirate, or the other kind of booty. Corvadera niger, a descendant of the crow. It has a long beak and bill and long legs, and in this aspect looks rather like a heron. Indeed, in summer it even behaves like a heron, wading into shallow pools and streams to dip for fish. In the winter, it develops insulating feathers along its legs to protect it from the cold and becomes a land predator, hunting any small animals that are active at the time. It probes for the Meechings through the snow, and with its long beak, it is able to penetrate deep inside their fortress. The other notable avian predator of the Meeching, the Gandimot, Bustivapus septentrionalis, is descended from the magpie. It retains much of its original body shape and coloration, but has a hooked beak and pointed wings like a skua. In summer, it feeds on rodents and small birds in the tundra, but spends the winters in the coniferous forests to the south as a scavenger. Its survival in the cold north is due in no small part to the fact that it is a brood parasite, laying its egg in the nests of other birds to be incubated and hatched by them. In this way, it conserves the energy it would otherwise use in nest building and brood rearing, at the expense, however, of the ducks and waders on whose nests the eggs were laid. Even though the Meechings have many predators, their birth rate is so high that under normal conditions the colonies thrive. Eventually, after about 4 or 5 years of continual growth, the local food supply of herbs, seeds, and mosses and lichens become depleted and can no longer support the colony. At this time, the Meechings migrate, and unprotected by their fortress, fall easy prey to their predators. Up to 40% of the migratory population may be wiped out before finding a new habitat. That is a devastating decrease. The old fortresses provide homes for several of the tundra's inhabitants. The lesser ptarmigan, Lagopa minutus, nests exclusively in old Meeching burrows and is sometimes found cohabiting with the Meechings themselves, usually in cases where part of the population has already migrated. Initially a 4 or 5 chamber nest, the Meeching's fortress grows exponentially, reaching its maximum size after about 5 years. The lesser ptarmigan nests exclusively in Meeching fortresses. In early autumn, the polar ravine molts its dull brown summer coat and grows a thicker, creamy brown covering of fur. Although the polar ravine is larger than the ravine in the temperate woodlands, it has smaller facial features. See, for instance, the comparison between the two ravines, the two coats of the ravines, the nest size of the Meechings, and the lesser ptarmigan. One of the largest birds of the tundra, the booty bird stands over a meter high and is shown here in its winter plumage. The Meeching's fortress is built of vegetable matter, principally mosses and lichens. The interior is divided into chambers, one for each adult. The booty bird, so called because of the shaggy feathers it grows to protect its legs in winter, is the Meeching's principal avian predator. So up at the top, we have the Gandammot, then we have the booty bird, then we have the Meeching. The polar ocean. Life in the northern seas. The northern polar sea is almost landlocked and contains a permanent ice cap, which has a considerable influence on the environment of the surrounding continent and contributes substantially to the stability of the region's cold climate. The ice cap is maintained only because the polar ocean is fed by enormous quantities of fresh water by the rivers of the surrounding continent. This gives the sea an unusually low salinity and is therefore a strong tendency to freeze over. In winter, the polar ocean is largely barren. In spring, however, the sunlight produces a bloom of unicellular algae near the surface, which provides food for the microscopic animal life that forms the basis of the oceanic food chain. In spring, shoals of pelagic fish come northwards through the northern island barrier to feed on the zooplankton, bringing with them countless numbers of seabirds. The first species to arrive is the flightless auk, Natarachlus maritimus, a totally aquatic creature with paddle-like wings. In this respect, they resemble the penguins, which were so successful in the southern oceans of earlier times. Except during winter, the flightless auks rarely come ashore or climb onto the ice, where they are quite defenseless. They retain their eggs until they are almost ready to hatch and lay them in the open water. The flightless auks first evolved at the northernmost tip of the northern continent and, as they became established, spread both east and west, forming a chain of subspecies in a ring around the polar ocean. Throughout most of the ring, each subspecies is able to breed with the neighboring ones, but where the ends of the chain overlap, the differences were so great that no interbreeding is possible, and these populations must be regarded as separate species. Preying on the flightless auks and also on the fish are the pytherons, Thalassomus piscivorus, a group of aquatic carnivorous mammals related to predator rats. They occupy the same ecological niche as the seals that occupied earlier in the age of mammals, and like them have developed streamlined blubbery bodies and fin-shaped limbs. Among the organic detritus on shallower areas of the ocean bed are found banks of shellfish. Living on these shellfish are the Distarterops, Scynoderidans, Solungulus, by far the most massive aquatic relative of the predator rats. It reaches a length of about 4 meters and has an insulated coat of matted fur made up of a mosaic of solid plates, giving it a lumpy rather than streamlined appearance. Its most unusual feature is its teeth. The upper incisors for the upper incisors yeah, the upper incisors form long pointed tusks. The left hand one projects forward, whereas the right hand one points straight down, and is used as a pick for removing shells from the sea bottom. This asymmetry is also found in the limbs. The left foreflipper only is equipped with a strong claw, which it uses to dislodge particularly stubborn shells. Because of the Starterops's evolutionary line separated from the predator rats when they were both still comparatively small rodent-like creatures, it would appear therefore that the predator rats' double-pointed incisor teeth, from which the Starterops tusks and also the Bartolot saber teeth have evolved, were a comparatively early development. The flightless ox exists as a chain of subspecies around the polar ocean, capable of breeding with their neighbors, excepting at the ends of the chain, where differences in size and physiology makes it impossible. The Pytheron, although totally unrelated, has an appearance similar to ancient seals and sea lions. Spread-eagled on an ice floe, the Pytheron appears lumpish and ungainly. In the water, it is swift and graceful, swimming like a penguin. Distarterops are gregarious creatures and are often found resting on ice floes during the summer months, in small groups containing both males and females. The female's tusks both curve downwards, whereas the male's tusks point in different directions. In all cases, the male's forward-pointing tusk is formed by the left-hand upper incisor, and similarly, only its left-hand flipper is endowed with a claw. So, the flightless ox, the largest species is 60 centimeters and the smallest one is 45. And you can see throughout the chain how they could theoretically interbreed until you get to this point where they can't. Then you have the Pytheron over here. Then you have the Distarterops over here, females and males, and the flightless ox swimming alongside the Distarterops. They're kind of like the predator rat equivalent of the predator rat equivalent of a walrus, except armor plated. In any event, the Southern Ocean, the origins and ancestry of the vortex. Let me quickly check and see how the poll is doing. Nope, nobody's voted yet. Then again, I don't think anybody's shown up yet, but that's okay. The origins and ancestry of the vortex. In contrast with the vast southern continent, which supports life only around the edges, the surrounding ocean teems with life. Among its most notable inhabitants is the vortex, Balaenornis vivipara, the largest animal found anywhere in the world. Resembling many of the sea creatures of the past, it has a long, tapering, neckless body, a powerful paddle-shaped tail, and long, stabilizing fins, an ideal arrangement for efficient movement through water. Similar shapes can be seen in the great arthrodires of the age of fishes, and the pliosaurs of the age of reptiles, and the whales of the first half of the age of mammals, the last creatures to occupy this ecological niche before the vortex. The vortex is in fact descended from the penguins, which, although they were birds, have long since lost the power of flight and were totally adapted to an aquatic life, excepting for one thing. They always had to come to shore to lay eggs. This remained so until, shortly after the extinction of the whales, one species of penguin developed the ability to retain its single egg internally until it was ready to hatch and give birth to live young in the open ocean. Freed from the necessity to come ashore, this species became completely marine and ultimately gave rise to a completely new order of marine birds, the pelagornids, of which the porpin, Stenabus piscivora, is the commonest surviving example. The pelagornids are unique in the aquatic world in that, like their ancestors, they are both warm-blooded and egg layers, albeit that their eggs are retained within the body until the moment of hatching. In this respect, they resemble the mammals and some reptiles. However, it is important to note that the pelagornids do not possess mammary glands with which to feed their young, as do mammals, and are warm-blooded, as reptiles are not. The porpin, like most of its class, is a fish eater. Its distinguishing feature is a long serrated beak that enables it to catch larger fish than would otherwise be possible. So successful has it been that it has remained virtually unchanged for the last 40 million years. Although a plankton eater and very much larger, the vortex is also a member of the order Pelagornid. Its beak has developed into a large plankton sieve, which consists of a very fine mesh of bone plates instead of coalesced hair, as in the case with the whale's baleen plates. Along the volcanic islands of the Southern Ocean are found the skern, a species of flightless seabirds that have evolved a unique behavioral quirk in response to the problem of incubating eggs in this hostile environment. As well as being a hazardous time for the embryo chicks, the parent birds also run the risk of exposure. The skern has solved the problem by laying its eggs in the warm volcanic sands of the islands and deserting them immediately afterwards. It is able to delay the time of laying until the temperature of the sand is exactly right. When a volcano shows sign of activity, it immediately becomes the scene of frenzied activity. The birds scramble ashore, and with the aid of their temperature-sensitive beaks, probe the sand for areas with the right condition for incubation. After laying the eggs 10 to 20 centimeters deep and covering them with sand, they return to the sea, seeing neither their eggs nor their offspring again. Skerns are found mainly around the volcanic islands of the Southern Ocean. They have oily green plumage, large feet and legs, and no wings. Skerns cannot walk, but use their hips to push themselves along on their bellies. Swimming at the surface, they sit very low in the water. When hunting fish underwater, they become graceful and agile swimmers. At over 12 meters long, the vortex is the largest creature on Earth. It is closely related to the fish-eating porpins, which are descended from the penguins. The vortex is a plankton eater. Its massive bird's beak has evolved into an effective sieve. So, we have the approximate 40-foot long porpin, which it's funny that in this age, the largest animal is about 40% the size of the largest one alive today. But that's probably just because these guys are only going to get bigger. And then we have the porpin over here, the ancient relative that is still around, and the skern, which is kind of a funny looking bird if you look at it. The mountains. The effect of altitude on animal communities. The flora of the mountains has much in common with that of the tundra regions because of the similarity in climate and climatic conditions found there. Low temperature, high precipitation, and short growing season in both habitats. Although the mountain areas of the world are so isolated and widely distributed that they can largely be regarded as separate faunal provinces, the fauna of the fold mountain belt between Africa and Europe show characteristics that are typical of the mountain life the world over. The ruffle, Rupisaltur vilupes, a descendant of the rabbit, exhibits many of these features. It has a rounded head and body and disc-like ears, adaptations that guard it against cold. It has long hair under the neck and body to protect its legs from the cold, and its teeth are well adapted for grazing mosses and lichens. The upper incisors are set at an angle and are used for scraping patchy vegetation from the surfaces of rocks and boulders. The growth, Hebecephalus montanus, a variety of small hornhead frequently found grazing on grassy southern-facing slopes, lives in small herds of 4 or 5 females guarded jealously by a male. The most apparent difference between males and females is in their horn structure. The males have flat, bony, plate-like horns, which they use to buffet one another in their frequent fights for herd dominance. The females' pointed pyramidal horns are much more deadly and are used to defend themselves and their young against predators. While the herd grazes, the male normally stands on a promontory watching for signs of danger. That's another word I haven't seen before, promontory. Where when it sees an intruder, the male signals by erecting its long flag-like tail, and the herd makes for the shelter of a nearby crag or cave. One of the deadliest predators found in the African European mountains is the sharak, Oromustela altifera, a carnivore related to the weasel-like panther, Vulpimustela, of the northern coniferous forests. Short-footed over difficult rocky terrain and well camouflaged by its mottled gray fur, it is the growth's principal enemy. The Sharaks hunt in packs, surrounding their prey or cornering them in ravines, sharing the kill among themselves. Perhaps the strangest mammal found in these regions is the parashrew, Penatocadus volitarius. The adults are unremarkable shrew-like creatures, but the juveniles possess one of the strangest devices found in the animal kingdom. At the end of their tails, they have a fantastic parachute structure formed by interwoven hair. There it is. Which they normally use only once before discarding. When the time comes to leave the parental nest, they launch themselves into the air, relying on the thermal currents that rise from these bare rocky slopes in summer to carry them to a fresh habitat, in some cases several kilometers away. As a means of dispersal, this is a bit hit and miss, but the inevitable high death rate that this behavior produces among young parashrews is more than compensated for by the large numbers of offspring produced by each adult breeding pair. The evolution of the parashrew's parachute tail is primarily due to the creature's insectivorous ancestry. It is thought that these early creatures used their tails as balancing organs when leaping to catch insects in midair. The parachute consists of soft curled hairs hooked together to form a mat, then held in shape by a series of bristles growing at the tip of the tail. The ruffle's front teeth are designed for eating mosses and lichen. Shaggy hair on the undersides of its legs and on its feet give it a booted appearance. The ruffle is sure-footed over boulders and loose scree. The young parachut's single migration flight may last for up to 24 hours. The parachute tail is present only during adolescence and is molted when the parachute becomes sexually mature. The ruffle and the parachute. Weird, but we've seen pretty weird stuff before. The animal life of mountainous areas is found at high altitude only during the summer months. In winter, when the snows come, herbivores such as the growths move to the lower levels to find shelter and grazing. The carnivorous animals, dependent on them for food, closely follow the herds on their seasonal migrations. The male growth stands lookout on a prominent rock, alert for signs of danger. Although female growths are well equipped to defend themselves, they will not normally fight unless forced to do so. The adult Shirak's coat is mottled with dark rosette markings. You can see the Shirak and the two morphs of the growth, which, incidentally, also appear on the cover of the 2018 revision. The reed stilt appears on the first edition. Deserts, the arid lands. The principal desert areas of the world are found in the two subtropical belts between latitudes 10 degrees and 35 degrees north and south of the equator. Very little land of the southern hemisphere lies between these altitudes, with the exception of the southernmost tip of the African subcontinent and the narrow tail of the South American island continent, and therefore the major deserts of the world lie in the northern hemisphere. Desert conditions are characterized by extreme dryness, and annual precipitation is less than 25 centimeters, and the sun evaporates all water that falls as rain. The lack of moisture reaching desert areas is due to a number of factors. The principal one is the descent of dry air from the upper atmosphere, a feature of the global circulation pattern that is typical of these latitudes. Air is drawn to the low pressure zones in equatorial regions, where it is heated and forced to rise. In the upper reaches of the atmosphere, the air spreads out from the equator, cools, and gradually descends, reaching the ground in desert areas, where it has very low water content. In some cases, a desert may owe its existence to being situated in the heart of a continent, far from any marine influence or moist wind. Allied to this is the rain shadow phenomenon, found in areas where air currents from the sea cross high mountains, dropping their rain on the seaward side as they rise. On the other side of the mountain, the air descends completely dry, giving rise to a desert area. The intensity of solar radiation in the desert is very great in comparison to other areas. In moist regions, up to 60% may be reflected away by clouds, atmospheric dust, water, and plant surfaces. But in deserts, only 10% of the total radiation is reflected in this way. On the other hand, due to the lack of insulating cloud cover, up to 90% of the accumulated heat of the day is lost at night through radiation. The result is an extremely large temperature difference between day and night, which may be as great as 40 degrees Celsius. The worldwide extent of deserts is now much smaller than was the case during the age of man. For one thing, there is a smaller area of land lying within the desert belt than there was then, due largely to the movement of the Australasian continent northwards out of the desert belt. Also in man's time, inefficient agricultural techniques and widespread grazing of domestic animals on poor land artificially enlarged the desert regions and was one of the factors that led to man's ultimate decline. With the desert becoming more extensive year by year, the area of the Earth's surface suitable for cultivation decreased. After man's disappearance, the Earth's natural habitats reestablished themselves and the deserts resumed their natural proportions. Life in the desert has to cope with many hostile factors, such as lack of water and extremes of temperature. Even so, a large number of animals and plants have evolved to cope with them successfully. Similar compensating adaptations, such as highly efficient kidneys producing particularly concentrated urine, large ears to dissipate heat, and the ability to burrow to depths at which conditions are less severe, have been developed independently in widely separated groups of animals in different areas of desert. Hold on a second. There we go. The world's hot deserts lying along the tropics are a product of the Earth's atmospheric circulation. The cold deserts occurring in the northern hemisphere owe their origin more to their position in the center of larger land masses. Examples of a desert. I assume you've seen what a desert looks like if you're ever a fan of like cowboy movies and whatever. And over here, we've got where the deserts lie. It's kind of hard to see because they mark the deserts in orange, even though, the land itself is orange, but take it or leave it, I suppose. The sand dwellers. Survival in a waterless sea. The physiology of desert animals must tread a narrow path between water conversion and heat regulation. The lack of sweat glands, a water-saving measure, means that less conventional ways must be used to cool the animal in the heat of the day. Usually, this is achieved by large ears or similar outgrowths, which, crisscrossed by blood vessels, act as radiators to remove the animal's body heat. A structure of this kind is found in the tail of the sand flapjack, Platycaudatus structor, a fairly large rodent found in sandy areas. Its excess body heat is carried away by the blood to the tail, where it is dissipated into the atmosphere. When pursued, the animal can move at speed, running with its lengthy tail held well out behind as a counterbalance, in the manner of its ancestor, the jerboa. To conserve water, the flapjack even constructs a condensate trap. As part of their courtship ritual, each pair of flapjacks places a pile of stones over the site of the family burrow. These stones, as well as protecting the burrow from the sun's direct rays during the day, provide a large number of cold surfaces on which the moisture can condense at night. The spitting featherfoot, Penipus sultans, is a rodent of a type that has existed in this environment ever since mammals first colonized the hot, dry areas of the Earth's surface. It has small forelimbs and long hind legs for jumping. The toes are fringed by short, stiff hairs. Its kidneys are highly efficient, recycling the animal's wastewater to the point that its urine is more than twice as concentrated as that of a rodent of a similar size living in a human environment. The featherfoot never drinks water, but obtains all the moisture it needs from plants. It can even eat plants that are poisonous to other animals, and has the ability to excrete toxic substances without their having taken part in any metabolic process. It is a nocturnal animal, but if displaced from its deep burrow by a predator during the heat of the day, it can cool itself by producing copious quantities of saliva and coating the front of its body with the foam, or with foam. It also spits at its foe with deadly accuracy. As the saliva contains most of the excreted poisons from the plant, it is an efficient weapon. Needless to say, this defense mechanism dehydrates the animal very quickly, and is therefore used only in dire emergency, and even then only for short periods at any one time. The leaping devil, Daemonops rotundus, an insectivore with carnivorous habits, is one of the featherfoot's chief predators, and has a morphology and physiology similar to the featherfoot, and to the other small desert rodents upon which it preys. A totally different predator, but one also descended from insectivore stock, is the desert shark, Samaraurus subspecies. It is sausage-shaped, with a blunt, strong head and powerful shovel-like feet. It swims through the sand rather than burrowing, bursting into the rodent's nesting chambers, which it locates using the sensory pits at the end of its nose. It is almost completely hairless, and avoids the extremes of temperature by remaining underground for most of the time. When it is at rest, it lies just below the surface, with only its eyes and nostrils protruding. The leaping devil is armed with long talons and a mouthful of sharp teeth. When pouncing on its prey, the leaping devil may travel up to 2 meters in a single jump. By foaming, the spitting featherfoot both coats itself and gets rid of unwanted toxins. Both cools itself and gets rid of unwanted toxins. The flapjacks cooperate in moving stones to construct their condensation traps. Although it is held out when running, the flapjack holds its tail aloft to catch the cooling breeze when standing still. The desert shark. Okay, yeah. So, here we go. Leaping devil, spitting featherfoot, leaping devil on the move, sand flapjack, also sand flapjack, and the desert shark. The desert shark is pink, wrinkled, and almost hairless. Its teeth are sharp, pointed, and all roughly the same size. The sand flapjack's burrow is capped with stones and twigs. At night, moisture condenses on the stones to provide drinking water. On very cold nights, so much moisture collects that it drips through to form a pool in the burrow below. The burrow lies 70 to 100 centimeters below the desert surface. Large desert animals. The problem with size and its solution. The extinction of the camel at about the same time as man died out left a niche that was distinctly unattractive to any other animal. For a large animal to exist in desert conditions, a quite remarkable physiology is required. The camel, for instance, was able to lose about 30% of its body weight through dehydration without ill effects, and it stored all the subcutaneous fat of its body in one lump, leaving the rest of the body free to radiate heat. It could tolerate fluctuations in its body temperature to some extent, and had thick nostril covers and eyelids that effectively kept dust and sand out of its nose and eyes. After some 50 million years of evolution, these features have all developed again in one animal, the desert leaper, Aquator adepsicatus. The leaper is descended from the rodents, possibly one of the jerboas or sand rats, and has grown large. Adult males may reach more than 3 meters from nose to tail. The tail is the most unusual feature of this animal. It is here that all its subcutaneous fat is stored. The fat is not a water store, but a store of food that enables the leaper to go for long periods without eating when food is unavailable. When the fat store is full, the animal's body is well balanced, and it can leap quickly along with its hind limbs. In this condition, it can undertake journeys of 100 kilometers or more between water holes and oases. It has broad, horny pads on its toes, on the toes of its hind feet, which prevent it from sinking into the sand and give it a good grip on naked rock. The rocky areas of the desert are the habitat preferred by the grobet, Ungulamus cerviform. This rodent is about 60 centimeters long, excluding the tail, and has hooves developed from its third and fourth digits, enabling it to run along the craggy landscape of the rocky desert. The second and fifth digits of its front feet have small claws, and that almost touch the hooves when the foot is bent, allowing the grobet to grasp and pull down the branches and feed on them. The grobet lives in packs all over the rocky desert zone of the African and Asian subcontinents. In the deserts, large predators are not common, and very few meat-eating mammals of any description are found. The killa, spelled Khilla, Carnosuchus pilopodus, however, descended from the insectivores, and is one of the few. Standing about 60 centimeters high at the shoulder, it is largely nocturnal and spends most of the day hidden in a network of burrows excavated in soft sand. At night, it hunts small mammals and obtains most of the water it needs from the moisture contained in their flesh. Most desert animals are sandy yellow in color to blend in with their surroundings, and have white undersurfaces that counteract the effects of shade and give them a two-dimensional appearance. That this color scheme is the result of evolutionary pressure is a belief supported by the darker appearance of animals found on black-gray lava areas and the almost white forms of the same animals found on salt pan regions. Animals that are not camouflaged are predominantly black. Predatory birds, reptiles, and the most poisonous and unpalatable arthropods fall into this category. The color resemblance may be due to a form of mimicry in which, for some reason, black is an advantageous color for certain predators, and all others adopt the same color to derive some similar benefit. Gonna mute that again because it's been over 3 hours. But we only got about an hour to go before I have to call the stream. So let's proceed. The grobet is purely herbivorous. Its long tail may grow to over 100 centimeters. The grobet feeds mainly on the leaves and shoots of desert shrubs. Its cloven hooves and dew claws are used in conjunction to grasp branches. The killa's insectivore dentition has been adapted to suit its carnivorous habits. It is largely nocturnal and equipped with broad burrowing forefeet. The creskin, a common predatory bird in the desert areas feeding principally on snakes, is, like many other predators of the region, mainly black in color. That would be the grobet, which is somehow not a rabuck, the killa, and the bird, the creskin. Then we have the desert leaper. The desert leaper stores fat in its tail. It can survive for up to 3 months without food. It eats mainly the leaves and shoots of desert shrubs and receives most of its moisture needs this way. When replete with food, the desert leaper moves in a series of jumps with its forelimbs folded across its chest. In its emaciated form, it runs in a four-legged fashion. The leaper can lose 50% of its body weight without lasting ill effects. Both male and female have hairy eyelids and retractable nostril covers as protection against sand. So you can see this is a desert leaper that's pretty well fed, and then this is a desert leaper that has gone. These are desert leapers that have gone without food for several months. So better get to eating or you'll die. Quickly grab some water. Well, I picked a bad time to stream. Jokes. A friend of mine is also streaming to talk about some of the announcement things. So good on her. Unfortunately, it cuts into my stream, but it is what it is. The North American deserts, living in the shadow of the mountains. The North American deserts are rain shadow deserts. The wet westerly winds that blow towards the continent across the Pacific Ocean first meet the Great Western Mountain Barrier and are forced to rise, dropping their rain on the seaward side. Past the peaks, the winds are dry, and desert conditions prevail on the extensive plains beyond. The deserts are not completely barren, but contain an intermittent vegetation consisting of cacti and other succulent plants, normally growing as single specimens, each widely separated from one another. The barren soil surface between the plants conceals a vast network of roots, spreading out to collect enough water for each plant to survive. Among the roots lives the root sucker, Palatops subspecies. an animal heavily armored to protect it from desiccation rather than to defend it from attack. Its head is shielded by a broad spade-like plate, and its back is covered by a shiny nut-like shell composed of compacted hair. Its tail and feet are also armored, but with articulated plates that permit total mobility. The root sucker moves through the sand, using its broad feet like paddles and its head shield as a shovel to reach the roots of succulents on which it feeds, gnawing them with the edge of its head shield and lower incisors. Among the thorns found in the vertical grooves of cactus stems lives the little desert spickle, Fistulostium setosum, its narrow body covered by spines that are partly for defense and partly for camouflage among the cactus thorns. It has no teeth and subsists entirely on the nectar of cactus flowers, which it drinks through its long snout. When collecting nectar, it often picks up pollen on its head. The pollen is eventually deposited on the stigmas of other flowers, thus affecting the cross-pollination of the cacti. Living almost solely on nectar, the spickle's digestive system is a very primitive affair, since nectar is very easily broken down. Lizards and other reptiles do not have the sophisticated mechanisms that mammals and birds have for regulating body temperature. Their temperature is entirely dependent on the surroundings. Several desert reptiles have, however, developed rudimentary devices for keeping themselves cool. The fin lizard, Veluceris bipod, for instance, a small bipedal reptile, has a system of erectile fins and dewlaps on its neck and tail, which it raises into the wind when its body becomes too hot. The heat is transferred through the fins via the bloodstream into the air. When cooling off, the lizard typically balances on one leg while keeping the other off the hot desert surface to get maximum benefit from the system. Small mammals of the desert, like the desert spickle and the I guess this is supposed to be small animals. Small animals of the desert, like the desert spickle and the fin lizard, are preyed upon by ground-dwelling birds, such as the long-legged quail, Deserta catholica. Its eggs, which are laid in sand scrapes in sheltered spots beneath bushes or overhanging rocks, are sat on continuously to protect them from the extremes of heat and cold that are typical of the desert climate's daily temperature range. The breeding cycle of this and many other desert birds is dependent on the rainy season, the birds nesting as soon as the first spring rains appear and continuing as long as the wet season lasts. In unusually dry years, no breeding takes place. To retain as much water as possible, the root sucker lies on the desert surface with its head shield drawn in tight against its body shell. Only the male long-legged quail has a head plume. The females are otherwise identical, although a little smaller. The eggs of the long-legged quail are laid in sheltered hollows in the desert sand. The desert spickle sucks nectar from cactus flowers through its long snout. For such an ungainly little animal, it can run surprisingly swiftly across the desert. Desert spickle, long-legged quail and its eggs, root sucker, which we see again over here with the root sucker and the fin lizard. The neck frills are full of blood vessels that lie near the surface and serve to keep the animal cool. The fin lizard can travel at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour. It stands on one leg with its neck and tail fins outstretched when cooling itself. The root sucker is equipped for digging with long pointed claws and a horny head shield. Bonk. Tropical grasslands. Between the fierce aridity of the desert belt and the constant humidity of the tropical forest regions lies an area where the rainfall is intermittent and erratic. The dominant plants are grasses, and the habitat is one of open plains with scattered scraps of brush and woodland. As the region lies wholly within the tropics, the sun is therefore directly overhead at any one place on 2 occasions each year. Most of the rainfall comes at these times because the tropical convergence of global winds and the wet conditions associated with them move north and south with the sun twice every year. The intervening dry seasons are due to the dry high-pressure belt associated with the deserts moving over the grassland area. The dominance of grasses over trees has more to do with the level of soil moisture than it has to do with the total amount of rainfall. Typically, only the upper soil layers contain water,
whereas the lower strata, where tree roots would be found, remain dry all year. Some areas of grassland receive substantial amounts of rain, but because it only occurs only at certain times of the year, trees are unable to establish themselves. Excuse me. Because of the general dryness of the region, it is highly susceptible to fire. Indeed, it is repeated destruction by frequent grassland fires that has produced the plants that are characteristic of the habitat. The trees are particularly hard and fire resistant, and the grasses grow from their bases rather than from the tips of their leaves and stalks. They also spread by means of underground runners, which allows their instant recovery after fire has swept the area and destroyed the exposed parts. The rapid recovery of trees and grasses from damage permits the grasslands to support large numbers of grass-eating animals despite the frequent fires. Only the upper parts of the leaves and stems are eaten, leaving the growing bases and the underground runners intact. Another feature of the grasslands that has an important influence on the fauna is the sparseness of cover. A grazing animal can therefore be seen by a predator from a great distance, and conversely, the grazing animal can see danger coming. Hence, both grazers and predators in the regions are highly adapted for speed and pursuit, and have long legs and quick reactions. Some birds, too, have found that they can survive on the grasslands using only their legs to take them out of trouble without recourse to flight. Another feature of tropical grassland life is migration. Because of the seasonality of rainfall, different areas of the grasslands provide food at different times of the year, and hence great migrations of grazing herds occur throughout the year. Migration also takes place to the grasslands from other parts of the world. Many birds summer in the temperate woodlands far to the north and fly south to the grasslands to escape the winters. As with the desert belts, the total land area of the globe lying within the tropical grassland climatic belt has diminished since the age of man due to the constant northward movement of the Australian continent. Although the largest extent of tropical grassland is on the African subcontinent, considerable expanses also exist on the South American island continent south of the equatorial rainforests. It's a little bit of a darker orange, so you can actually kind of see them a little bit better where you would find those tropical grassland environments. The grass eaters, ground-dwelling birds and herbivorous herds. The grasslands, both tropical and temperate, are home of the running animals. The long vistas and the general lack of cover make concealment difficult, and speed is the most practical means of defense. The grasslands first appeared on a large scale about 80 million years ago, when a general reduction in global temperatures, causing a drop in average rainfall, produced a reduction in the area of forest found on the Earth. At this time, the mammals had been in existence for about 20 million years, or that had been in existence for about 20 million years, developed running forms in large numbers for the first time. The grasses, representing a vast untapped food source, had, however, a high silica content, which made them much tougher than the leaves of trees to which the browsing mammals were accustomed. To deal with this more fibrous material, new tooth structures appeared that had hard enamel ridges and cusps to grind down the grass before it was swallowed. New elaborate digestive systems were also evolved to deal effectively with it. By the age of man, the long-legged grazers, the ungulates such as the zebra, Equus, and the gazelle, Gazella, were the most successful animals of the tropical grasslands. However, the rabucks, which originated in temperate woodlands after man's extinction, spread southwards, round the mountain barriers into the African and Indian subcontinents, where they flourished and competed so effectively with the ungulates that in time they largely replaced them. Although many forms of rabuck inhabit the same region, because of their different feeding habits, they do not compete directly with one another. The little picktooth, Dolabrodon fossor, feeds on low-growing herbs and roots, which it digs up with its tusks and spurs. Its second incisor teeth are developed into strong, laterally directed tusks, and it has long spur-like claws on the fourth digit of each forefoot. As it runs only on the second and third toes of each foot, the spurs do not hinder it. The taller grasses are grazed by vast herds of larger rabucks, Ungulagus subspecies. They tend to be similar to their temperate cousins, but are on a whole lighter in build and have longer legs and ears. Their coloration is very different, consisting mostly of pale brown and white, arranged in stripes or spots, uh, arranged in stripes or spots, depending on the species. The strank, U virgatus, has a dazzling pattern of stripes like the extinct zebra, while the larger watu, U cento or kento, it's spelled with a C, so I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to go with U cento. Carries large angular blotches similar to those once possessed by the giraffe. Such patterns make individuals merge into one another so that a distant predator gets only a confused impression of the herd as a whole. It is particularly effective in thorn thickets and areas of scrubby woodland. All rabucks, whether temperate or tropical, retain the dazzling white tail of their rabbit ancestors. It is used as a warning signal when the herd is attacked. The tropical grasslands are the home of a species of large flightless guinea fowl, Pseudostruthio gularis. Standing about 1.7 meters high, it sports a startling selection of erectile wattles and inflatable throat pouches, which are used in threat displays when dominance or pecking order is threatened. It is an omnivorous bird and feeds on seeds, grasses, insects, and small reptiles. Although it can deal a lethal blow with its broad feet in common with most plain-dwelling animals, it runs off when real danger threatens. The flightless guinea fowl. Okay, the flightless guinea fowl is found in the African subcontinent south of the equator. It is one of the fiercest and most territorial of all tropical ground-dwelling birds. Except for the color of their legs, there is little difference between males and females. Males have pink legs and females have blue. When threatened, the guinea fowl inflates its throat pouch, arches its head far back until it nearly touches its back, and utters a shrill, throaty scream. Mating occurs in the early summer, and normally results in 1 or 2 eggs being laid 5 or 6 weeks later. The incubation is shared by both males and females. The flightless guinea fowl, which is kind of a bizarre-looking thing, but imagine effectively a very flamboyant 6-foot-tall ostrich, and you kind of have a basic idea as to what the heck this thing is supposed to be. Hello, cat. Are you going to bite me again? The picktooth. Only 2 of the picktooth's toes are functional. The 4th toe on each of its front feet has developed into a spur. Sorry, cat, I need this position for reading. The picktooth skull is similar to a rabbit's. Its tusks are developed from its front incisors. The strank stripes produce a confused impression from a distance. Blotched markings give the watu camouflaged in areas of scrubby woodland. So, the picktooth, the watu, and the strank. I wonder how he comes up with some of these names. I guess whatever just rolls off the tongue best. Giants of the plains. The place of large herbivores in a tropical environment. The elephants flourished throughout the first half of the age of humans, but with man's appearance their numbers fell until they had almost become extinct. 2 genera only, Elephas and Loxodonta, were laterally contemporaries of man, and both of those had died out shortly before man's disappearance, leaving no descendants. The ecological niche which they vacated was eventually filled by the descendants of a surviving group of antelopes, the gigantelopes. These enormous creatures with tree-trunk legs and weighing up to 10 tons became the giant herbivores of the tropical plains, a group of animals feeding on trees, grasses, or roots depending on the species. They had long since abandoned the antelope's running gait and had instead taken up a plodding existence, the 2-toed feet of their ancestors having become broad-hooved pads. The typical grass-dwelling type, Megalodorcus giganteus, has 4 horns, one pair curving downward behind its ears, and another pair pointing outward in front of its snout. Each horn has a pick-like point, enabling the animal to scrape soil away from the plant roots and bulbs on which it feeds. The animal's basic shape has become was highly successful, and in the course of time the gigantelope spread northwards from tropical Africa, crossing the Himalayan uplands in 2 separate waves of migration, one spreading into the Coniferous Forests and giving rise to the hornheads, Carnudense subspecies, and the other, much later, reaching the tundra and providing the ancestors of the woolly gigantelope, Megalodorcus borealis. Once the massive body of the gigantelope was established, a number of variations appeared. The earliest of these, the earliest was the long-necked gigantolope, Grandidorcus roselmivi. It's hard to say. A gigantolope able to browse on twigs and branches 7 meters above the ground, well out of reach of the smaller herbivores and even its own massive cousins. As well as a long neck, this animal also has a long, narrow head, enabling it to push its thick, muscular lips between the branches of the trees to reach the tastiest morsels. The horns of its ancestors are reduced to long, low, bony pads on the top of its skull. Anything more elaborate would become entangled in the branches. At first glance, these massive beasts appear to contradict the general rule that animals of hotter climates tend to be smaller than their equivalents in cooler areas. The larger an animal is, the smaller its surface area is in relation to its body mass, and the more difficult it is for it to lose excess heat. In the case of the gigantelopes, however, this problem is overcome by the possession of a large dewlap beneath the neck, which is well served with blood vessels and effectively increases the creature's body area by about a fifth, thus providing an efficient heat radiator. The rhinoceros, another of the massive tropical grassland animals that became extinct during the Age of Man, has an almost direct equivalent in the gigantelopes, the rundehorn, Tetracerus africanus. It has adopted a body size and horn arrangement not unlike its predecessors, and is a grazing animal, a fact that is reflected by its broad snout and muzzle. Its alarming horn array is used for defense, although the animal has few enemies likely to risk a frontal attack. For the males, however, its secondary function, for sexual display, is now more important. The long-necked gigantelope is a browser and eats the leaves and shoots of trees. It has 2 vestigial horns, no more than bony pads on top of its head. Unlike most members of the gigantelope family, long-necked gigantelopes are not herd animals. They are typically found in 1s and 2s in lightly wooded areas around the margins of the tropical forests. The gigantelope's immediate ancestors had long, double-pointed antler-like horns. In some, the rear portions disappeared, leaving long, forward-pointing prongs. Until recently, the shovel-horned gigantelope was found on the grasslands. It is thought to have lived near rivers and lakes, and to have fed mainly on water plants. So, we have the long-necked gigantelope in its various forms, more basal forms of the gigantelopes, and the recently extinct shovel-horned gigantelope. The gigantelope and rundehorn are representative members of a family of tropical heavy grazing animals that are descended from the now extinct antelopes. The gigantelopes, like the previous occupants of this ecological niche, the elephants and rhinos, are purely herbivorous. No such thing as a pure herbivore, but you can get pretty damn close. There's the rundehorn, and here is the classic gigantelope. The meat eaters, predators and scavengers of the plains. Got about half an hour to go. Let's see how we do. Although the two principal predators on the tropical grasslands of the African subcontinent are both primates, they have evolved along very different lines and hunt different prey. Hold on. The horain, Phobosebes homunculus, is descended from the tree-dwelling apes of the tropical forest, a fact indicated by the way that the animal walks on its knuckles, on the knuckles of its forefeet. It leads a totally ground-dwelling carnivorous mode of life. Lying in the long grass, where it is camouflaged by its stripes and mane, it waits for its chief prey, the gigantelopes. As they pass by, the horain leaps out onto the back or neck of its quarry, using its sickle-like claws to rip deep wounds around the neck and throat. Severely wounded, the gigantelope soon dies, providing a meal for the whole horain family group. The other main predator is the raboon, Carnopapio subspecies. Descended from the baboons that flourished on the grasslands during the Age of Man, Their diet changed from omnivorous to carnivorous during the period that the big cats of the grasslands died out. At the same time, they increased their speed by taking to their hind limbs and adopting a totally bipedal locomotion. The forelimbs became reduced and the head was carried further forward, balanced by a thick, heavy tail. In physical form, the raboon bears a distinct resemblance to the carnivorous dinosaurs that died out more than 100 million years ago. A number of species of raboon, each living on different species of prey, exist in family-based tribes, like the ancestral baboon. Ancestral baboons. Carnapapio longipes is a very small, lightly built species around 1.8 meters high that hunts smaller animals. C. vulgaris is the most widely ranging species and preys on the rabok herds. C. grandis is the most massive of the genus. It stands at about 2.3 meters high at the hip and lives purely as a scavenger. As predators such as the horan eat only the softer tissues and muscles of the gigantelope's belly and anal regions, there is always plenty of meat left for the scavengers. The giant raboon concentrates on the meat of the limbs and the neck, leaving the rest for smaller, less powerful carrion feeders. The most efficient predator of the scavenger of the African grasslands is the gull, Palidogale nudicolum. I got distracted. The most efficient scavenger of the African grasslands is the gull, Palidogale nudicolum, a creature that resembles a large mongoose. Its head and neck are almost totally devoid of hair, allowing it to reach inside the body cavities of carcasses without its coat becoming fouled. Its canine teeth are particularly huge and capable of crushing most bones to get at the marrow. Gulls live in packs of about a dozen and have developed an almost symbiotic relationship with a species of termite. This termite builds its mound with a horizontal shell projecting all round, a meter or so above the ground. This shell provides shelter from the fierce midday sun, where the gull can bring bones and other tough parts of its meal to chew at leisure. The termites feed on the scraps of carrion that the gull invariably leaves scattered around the mound, thus benefiting from the relationship. It usually takes about 3 days for the predators and scavengers of the grasslands to reduce a gigantelope to no more than a few pieces of bone and hide and a patch of stained, trampled ground. The final remnants are consumed by insects and microorganisms. The raboon is directly descended from the baboon. It has evolved a bipedal stance and much heavier hindquarters. Male raboons are larger than females, and only the males have manes. Their teeth follow the general carnivore pattern. The gull's head and neck are totally hairless. Its massive canine teeth and molars are designed for breaking and crushing bones. Gulls frequently devour their food beneath the shelter of an overhanging termite mound, where they find protection from the sun. The termites, in return, feed on the remaining scraps. So, a not too detailed look at the raboon, the male-female sexual dimorphism, gull head and skull, and the relationship that it shares with the termite mound. Now let's take a look at the big one. The gigantelope's principal predator is the horan, a predatory primate. The horan's hunting strategy relies heavily on concealment and the element of surprise. The raboons form a group of predatory and carnivorous animals. The largest, Carnapapio grandis, is a scavenger. More powerful than the horan, it feeds on the tougher parts of the carcass. The next in line in the chain of predators and scavengers is formed by the gulls. They are unable to compete with the raboons and must wait until they have finished. Gulls feed mainly on the skeletal remains. They crack open the bones to get at the marrow, which provides them with most of their nutritional needs. So, as you can see, we have the horan, the kind of velociraptor apes. Then we have the three main species of raboons. This is C. longipes, the small one that mostly feeds on rabucks, and vulgaris, which is one of the larger breeds. And then you have the grandis, which is the predominant large scavenger of the area. And then you have the gulls down here that are picking apart the gigantelope carcass, moving your way down throughout the course of a few days. Just clearing a few notifications so that I can keep the important ones I want to take a look at later. And let us take a look. Tropical forests. This may end up, yeah. The tropical forests. Tropical forests are found in a broad belt encircling the world at the equator, broken only by oceans and mountains. Their distribution coincides with the band of low-pressure areas that occurs where rising tropical air is replaced by moist air flowing in from the north and south to form a system of converging winds. The rainforest is the floral product of great heat and copious moisture. At all times, the average temperature must be in between about 21 and 32 degrees Celsius, and the annual rainfall in excess of 150 centimeters. As the sun is roughly overhead throughout the year, the climatic conditions have a consistency found in no other habitat. Tropical forests are often associated with great rivers, which carry away the copious rainfall. Such rivers are found in the South American island continent, the African subcontinent, and the subcontinent of Australia. Just as a quick heads up, I think I'm actually going to make the tropical forest explanation the last bit, and then I will record a more traditional audiobook style video for the rest of the book because I'm getting at that point where it's like, I need to stop talking. Despite the constant fall of discarded leaves, the soils of the rainforest are very thin. The conditions are so favorable for decomposition that humus does not have a chance to form. The tropical rain washes the clay minerals out of the soil, preventing important nutrients such as nitrates, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and calcium from being retained as they are in temperate soils. The only nutrients found in tropical soils are contained in the decomposing plants themselves. There are many variations on the basic form of tropical forest, resulting both from climatic and environmental differences, or resulting both from climatic and local environmental differences. Yeah, sign that I'm talking too much. Gallery forest is found where the forest comes to an abrupt halt, as at the edge of a broad river. Here, the branches and leaves form a dense wall of vegetation reaching the ground, to take advantage of light coming in from the side. Less luxuriant monsoon forests exist in regions where there is a distinct dry season. They are found at the edge of continental areas, where the prevailing winds blow from the dry interior at one particular time of year, and are typical of the Indian Peninsula and the parts of the Australian subcontinent. I almost said Australasian, which is not wrong, but also not what was written. Mangrove forest is found in saline swamp areas along muddy shorelines and the mouths of rivers. There is no dominant species of trees in the tropical rainforest as there is in other forest habitats. That is because there are no seasons, and therefore the insect population does not fluctuate. The insects will feed on a particular species of tree are always present and will destroy the seeds and seedlings of that tree if they are sown nearby. Therefore, the only seeds that flourish are those that are transported some distance away from their parent and its permanent insect population. In this way, stands of particular tree species are prevented from forming. The main area of tropical forest has increased considerably during the age of man, since the age of man. In the past, a great deal of damage was done to the habitat by man's agricultural practices. Primitive societies cut down areas of trees and farmed the clearings for a few years until the thin soil became exhausted, compelling them to move on to another area. In the cleared areas, the original forest did not immediately reestablish itself, and it was many thousands of years after man's extinction before the tropical forest belt returned to anything like its natural condition. Tropical forest is found in equatorial latitudes where converging air currents bring large quantities of rain to the region in all seasons. This, combined with the constant high temperatures, produce the forest's characteristic luxuriant vegetation. That's what it looks like on the map. That's what it looks like in the thing. I was intending on making this last until 6:30, but unfortunately, this is why I don't do longer streams than about 3 hours, because it gets to a point where I just have to stop talking, and move on with my day. So I'm going to stop that now. Thanks for those who decided to tune in very briefly and those who will tune in after the fact. There will be a sequel to this. It probably won't be live streamed, I don't think. We will see, but there will definitely be an analog that will come along to help finish up this book because we still have quite a few habitats to go through. So don't forget to be awesome. I'll see you guys on the other side. And tomorrow, I believe, we are doing the Arkham City live stream. I'm just very quickly double checking. Yes. No, Injustice 2. Tomorrow we're doing the Injustice 2 live stream. Arkham City's on St. Patty's Day. Don't forget to be awesome, and I'll see you guys on the other side. Bye.